There's something I've always found unusual about the way certain names are remembered, not for what's clearly written about them, but for what gets added later, almost quietly, over time. Mary Magdalene is one of those names. When I first began looking into her story more carefully, I noticed how familiar she seemed, yet how little of that familiarity actually came from the texts themselves. It made me pause, because when I went back and read the accounts slowly, without assumptions, a very different picture started to take shape. She appears in the Gospels not as a background figure, but as someone present at the most pivotal moments, standing near the crucifixion when many others had stepped away, and returning to the tomb while it was still dark before anything had been fully understood. In the Gospel of Luke, she's mentioned among those who had been healed, specifically described as someone from whom 7 demons had gone out. It's a detail that's often repeated, but rarely explored with any depth. In the Gospel of John, her role becomes even more striking. She's the one who remains, the one who sees, and the one who speaks first after the resurrection. That stayed with me, because it shifts something, quietly, but significantly. Over time, layers of interpretation began to gather around her story. Assumptions, traditions, and identities that weren't always rooted in the original texts. And somewhere along the way, the simplicity of what's actually written became harder to see. So tonight, I want to set all of that aside, not to challenge it directly, but just to return to the earliest accounts we have and move through them slowly, to listen without adding anything extra, to notice what's there, and just as importantly, what isn't. As I read through these passages again, what stands out isn't mystery in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter, a kind of steady presence, someone who doesn't disappear when things become uncertain, someone who stays. And maybe that's where the real story begins. We'll take our time with it, letting each moment unfold without rushing ahead. You don't need to hold on to every detail or keep track of every name. Just let the narrative move gently, in its own rhythm. If your mind starts to drift as we go, that's completely fine. You can let the words pass by, like something distant and soft, without needing to follow them all the way through. Before we begin, settle in, however feels most comfortable. Let your breathing slow and allow the room around you to grow a little quieter. If this kind of calm, careful return to the original stories helps you unwind, then stay with me. We'll move through her story piece by piece and let it reveal itself without interruption. There is something I want to share with you tonight. A story that has been told, retold, misread, and misunderstood for 2,000 years. And yet, at its heart, remains one of the most quietly remarkable stories in all of ancient scripture. I want to take you back to the 1st century, to a small stretch of shoreline on the western edge of the Sea of Galilee, to a world very different from our own, and yet filled with the same kinds of longing, suffering, and hope that we carry today. We are going to explore the life of a woman named Mary, a woman from a town called Magdala. And I want to promise you right from the beginning that what the ancient texts actually say about her is far more compelling than anything the centuries of legend and misreading have added on top. So let yourself settle in tonight. Let your breathing slow. We are going to take this gently, one layer at a time, moving through her story as carefully and honestly as the ancient sources allow. I find this particular story worth telling slowly because so much has been piled onto this woman's name. Assumptions, projections, traditions, that the real person underneath has sometimes been almost impossible to see. But she is there in the texts, waiting. And tonight, we begin to find her. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is just how little the biblical text actually tells us about who she was before she encountered Jesus. The whole of her origin story, her background, her identity, it fits inside a single verse. When the Gospel of Luke introduces her in chapter 8, verse 2, she is listed simply as one of several women who had followed Jesus, and she is described as someone from whom 7 demons had gone out. That is it. That is the entirety of what Luke gives us about her past. There is no mention of her family, no description of her appearance, no indication of her social class or her profession. She arrives in the story already changed, already healed, and the text moves on almost immediately. What we do know from that same passage, Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, is that she and other women were traveling with Jesus and the 12 disciples, and that these women were supporting the ministry financially out of their own means. Think about what that tells us already. She had resources. She had the freedom to travel. She had made a choice to follow. Her very name gives us our first genuine clue about who she was. The name Magdalene is not a title or a description. It is a geographic marker. It simply means she was from Magdala, a town on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And here is something I find genuinely fascinating. We are no longer guessing about what Magdala looked like, because archaeologists have actually been excavating the site since 2009. What they have found there paints a vivid picture of a prosperous, busy, deeply Jewish community. They have uncovered a 1st century synagogue, one of only 7 known from that entire period still standing in Israel. They have found a harbour, market structures, and installations used for processing and salting fish, which was a major industry along the Galilee shore. They have found coins and pottery that date squarely to the 1st century, the very time when Mary would have lived and walked those streets. Magdala sat on the ancient road known as the Via Maris, a major trade route that connected Egypt to Syria, which means it was not some isolated backwater. It was a town connected to the wider world. The historian Josephus, writing in his Jewish War, described Magdala as a place of considerable size and economic activity. When I picture Mary Magdalene, I try to picture her against this backdrop, not a mythological figure floating in sacred abstraction, but a real woman who grew up beside a working lake, in a real town, in a real century. Now there is something else her name tells us, and I want to make sure we get this right because it has been misread for a long time. Some popular traditions have suggested that Magdalene means tower woman, implying some kind of metaphorical title related to her character or her moral standing. But that is not how the name works. Richard Bauckham, a highly respected biblical scholar who wrote a careful study called Gospel Women in 2002, is clear on this point. Magdalene is simply a geographic demonym, the same way we might say someone is from Chicago or a New Yorker. It tells you where she came from. It does not tell you who she was in any deeper sense than that. And this matters because we are going to encounter throughout this story many layers of interpretation and legend that have been draped over Mary Magdalene. And I think it is worth being precise about what is actually in the text and what is not. The text gives us a place name. Scholars and traditions gave us everything else. I am not saying tradition has no value, but I want us to know clearly what we are working with at each step. Let me also spend a moment on the women listed alongside her in Luke chapter 8. Mary Magdalene is named first, And this is worth noting, because in ancient lists, order often carried meaning. After her comes Joanna, described as the wife of Chusa, who was Herod's household manager. So here was a woman with a connection to the royal court itself. Then comes Susanna, and then the text says, many others. This little group of women, supporting Jesus' ministry with their own financial resources, represents something genuinely remarkable in the context of first-century Jewish life. The scholar Amy Jill Levine, in her work on the Jewish context of Jesus' ministry, has helped many of us understand just how unusual it would have been for women to travel openly in this way as part of a religious movement. And yet, here they are, named, present, active, and contributing. Mary Magdalene stands at the front of that list each time it appears in the Gospels, not just in Luke, but in the accounts of the crucifixion and the resurrection as well. The ancient writers were telling us something by placing her first, even if they did not spell it out in so many words. What about those 7 demons? I want to sit with this for a moment, because these 2 words have done more damage to Mary Magdalene's reputation than almost anything else, and they deserve honest, careful treatment. The phrase appears in Luke chapter 8, verse 2, and it is repeated in Mark chapter 16, verse 9. In both cases, the text simply states that 7 demons had gone out of her. There is no elaboration, no explanation of what the affliction looked like, no connection to any particular kind of sin or behavior. Nothing. The number 7 in Hebrew scriptural thinking often carried the sense of completeness or totality. You find this throughout the wisdom literature, as in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 16. So, 7 demons may have been a way of saying that her affliction was total, all-encompassing, that whatever she suffered from, it had consumed her entirely before Jesus healed her. John Meyer, one of the most thorough scholars of the historical Jesus, and Graham Twelftree, who wrote specifically about Jesus as an exorcist in the ancient world, both help us understand that healing from demonic affliction in the first-century Jewish context was understood as divine restoration, a bringing back to wholeness, not a moral rescue from a sinful life. What the text shows us is someone who was suffering, who was healed, and who then followed the one who had healed her. That is a human story. That is something any of us can understand. And here is something I find deeply moving about the way Luke arranges this passage. Immediately after telling us that Mary and these other women had been healed of various afflictions, he tells us they chose to go with Jesus, not as an obligation, not because anyone commanded them, but as a free response to what had happened to them. They used their own money. They gave their own time. They walked the roads of Galilee alongside a traveling teacher and his disciples. In the ancient world, this kind of choice carried real cost. Traveling was physically demanding. Leaving home was socially complicated. Supporting a religious movement with your own finances was a significant commitment. And yet, Mary Magdalene made that choice. The 3rd century Christian thinker, Origen, when he reflected on her healing, understood it in an entirely allegorical and restorative sense, not as a mark of past shame, but as a movement from darkness into wholeness. And I think that is the most natural reading of the text itself. She was healed, she responded, she stayed. What strikes me, as I read the biblical accounts carefully alongside scholars like Bauckham and Levine, is how consistently the gospel writers treat Mary Magdalene as a figure of genuine authority and presence, despite giving her so little biographical detail. She is not introduced with a story the way Peter is. She is not given a calling scene the way Matthew or Levi receives one. She simply appears, already healed, already following. And then she remains. She remains through the ministry in Galilee. She remains at the cross when others are gone. She remains at the tomb. There is a quality of steadiness in her that the texts register without ever commenting on directly, and I find that quality one of the most quietly powerful things about her. In a narrative world where the disciples are often shown doubting, fleeing, or misunderstanding, this woman from Magdala keeps showing up. The archaeological work at her hometown only deepens that sense. She came from a real place. She lived a real life, and she made real choices. As we move through this documentary together, I want to keep returning to that foundation. The text, the archaeology, the careful scholarship, because we are going to encounter many centuries of interpretation and tradition layered over Mary Magdalene's story, and some of those layers are genuinely fascinating. Some of them are beautiful, and some of them, as we will discover, were built on mistakes that had enormous consequences for how this woman was remembered and understood for more than 1,000 years. But before we can appreciate what was added or what was distorted, we need to know what was actually there at the beginning. And what was there at the beginning is this: a woman from a prosperous Galilean fishing town, healed of something that had diminished her, who chose to follow Jesus and support his work, and who is named in every single gospel at the moments that matter most. That is where her story starts. It is a small and human beginning, and it opens into something extraordinary. Tonight, as you rest, I want to leave you with that image of Mary Magdalene standing at the very start of her story. She is standing somewhere on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, in a town with a working harbour and a synagogue, and streets busy with the commerce of fish and trade. Something has happened to her. Something has been lifted from her, and she has made a decision. She is going to follow. She is going to contribute. She is going to stay. We do not know what she looked like. We do not know what her family thought. We do not know what private prayers she carried. But we know she was there, because the ancient writers remembered her name, placed it first on their lists, and recorded her presence at the most significant moments of everything that followed. In the chapters ahead, we are going to walk with her through those moments, to the cross, to the tomb, through the garden on that quiet first morning, and then through the centuries of legend and rediscovery that shaped how the world came to know her name. For now, rest in the simplicity of this beginning. A woman named Mary, a town called Magdala, a healing and a choice. That is enough to hold on to tonight. I want to take you back even further now. Behind Mary Magdalene's story, behind her healing, behind her decision to follow, to the world she was born into and grew up inside. Because no one exists outside of their time and place. And if we want to truly understand her, we need to feel something of the air she breathed, the pressures she lived under, and the social realities that shaped every day of her life in first-century Galilee. This is the kind of context that ancient texts sometimes skip over, because their original readers already knew it. The way a letter sent between friends does not explain the city both people live in. But we are reading across 2,000 years, and the world of Roman-occupied Galilee is genuinely foreign to us in many important ways. So I want to walk you through it tonight, with as much care and honesty as the historical sources allow. What we find, when we look carefully, is not a peaceful pastoral setting of rolling green hills and simple fishermen. What we find is a land of real tension, real poverty alongside real wealth, real political anxiety, and real spiritual hunger. Let me start with the political reality because it shaped everything else. During the years of Jesus' ministry, the period when Mary Magdalene chose to follow him, the region of Galilee was ruled by Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great. Herod Antipas was what historians call a client king, meaning he held power not on his own authority, but as a subordinate of Rome, answerable to the empire, dependent on its backing, and tasked with keeping order and taxation flowing in his territory. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in his work Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, gives us a detailed picture of Antipas and his reign, and it is not a flattering one. Luke's Gospel, in chapter 3, verse 1, places the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry during this time, noting the specific rulers in power, a detail that grounds the entire story in real political history. Above Antipas sat the machinery of Rome, with its governors, its legions, and its insatiable demand for tribute. The ordinary people of Galilee, the farmers, the fishermen, the traders, existed within this system and felt its weight in their daily lives. This was the world Mary Magdalene inhabited, and it was not a world of ease. The fishing economy of the Sea of Galilee is something I find particularly worth understanding, because Magdala sat at its heart. The lake, which the Romans sometimes called Lake Tiberias, was enormously productive, and the fish salting and processing industry centered at Magdala made the town prosperous. The scholar K. C. Hansen, writing in the Biblical Theology Bulletin in 1997, examined the economy of the Galilean fishing industry in careful detail, and what he found was that while the lake itself was plentiful, the economic system built around it was heavily extractive. Fishing licenses, boat taxes, processing fees, all of these flowed upward through the Herodian system and ultimately to Rome. The people who did the physical work of fishing and processing often kept relatively little of what they produced. The archaeological discoveries at Magdala itself confirm this picture. The town had genuine wealth, as evidenced by the coins and the scale of its market structures, but that wealth was not evenly distributed. Mary's ability to support the Jesus movement financially suggests she was among those with some means, perhaps a merchant family or someone who had prospered within this system. But she lived surrounded by people for whom economic pressure was a daily reality. Now, I want to tell you something about the lives of women in this world specifically, because it is essential to understanding what Mary Magdalene's choices actually cost her and what they represented. In the legal and social framework of first-century Jewish society, a framework described by Josephus in his Antiquities, Book 4, Chapter 8, women were not permitted to offer testimony in civil courts. Their word was not considered legally valid in the same way a man's was. This was not a uniquely Jewish position. Roman law had similar restrictions, and the broader Mediterranean world generally placed women under significant legal and social constraints. Women were expected to remain within domestic spaces, under the authority of a father or husband, and a woman traveling publicly with a group of men, as Mary Magdalene did, was doing something genuinely unusual and socially exposed. I say this not to make the story dramatic, but because I think we sometimes read the Gospels as if their world shared our assumptions, and it did not. When Luke records that these women traveled with Jesus and supported him financially, he is recording something that would have raised eyebrows in the world he was writing about. And then there is the matter of what the ancient world understood by the phrase demonic affliction, because this too is something we need to sit with carefully before we can understand Mary's experience as her contemporaries would have understood it. The scholar John Meyer, In the second volume of his monumental work, A Marginal Jew, she spends considerable time on the question of demon possession in the Second Temple Jewish period. And what he helps us see is that this was a genuine category of experience in the ancient world, not simply a primitive misunderstanding of mental illness, but a framework for understanding certain kinds of suffering that fell outside ordinary explanation. The world of first-century Judaism had a developed understanding of spiritual forces, drawn from texts like the Book of First Enoch, which described hierarchies of angels and fallen spirits. Within that framework, certain afflictions, things that caused a person to lose control of themselves, to suffer in ways that seemed beyond ordinary illness, could be understood as spiritual in nature. When Luke says that 7 demons had gone out of Mary Magdalene, and he is using the language and conceptual framework of his time and place, what we know is that she suffered and that the suffering ended. How we understand that medically or spiritually across the distance of 2,000 years is a genuinely open question, and I think honesty requires us to hold it as such. The discovery of a ritual bath, a mikveh, at the Magdala archaeological site tells us something quietly important about the community Mary grew up in. A mikveh was used for ritual purification, a practice central to observant Jewish life. Its presence in Magdala signals that this was a community keeping the ancient practices of their faith, following the Torah's requirements for purity and holiness, even while living under Roman occupation. This matters because it means Mary Magdalene was almost certainly raised in a practicing Jewish household, shaped by the rhythms of Sabbath observance, festival celebrations, synagogue attendance, and the vast tradition of Hebrew scripture that formed the backbone of Jewish identity in that era. When she encountered Jesus, himself a Jewish teacher, moving through Galilean synagogues and speaking the language of the Hebrew prophets, she was not encountering a foreign religion. She was encountering something that grew from the same soil she had been planted in. The faith she carried into her following of Jesus was built on a foundation of Torah and temple and the ancient promises of the God of Israel. Think about what it would have been like to live in Galilee in those years, with all of this pressure accumulating. Roman occupation meant not just political humiliation, but the constant physical presence of soldiers, the constant drain of taxation, and the constant reminder that your people were not free. Herod Antipas, who would later execute John the Baptist, as all 4 Gospels and Josephus record, was not a ruler who inspired trust or affection among the Jewish population. And into this environment came a remarkable phenomenon: a traveling teacher from Nazareth, moving through the villages and synagogues of Galilee, healing people, teaching about the kingdom of God, and drawing crowds wherever he went. Mark's Gospel opens this period in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, with Jesus proclaiming that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. For people living under occupation, those words carried an electric charge. They spoke directly into the longing for something to change, something to be restored. I think about Mary Magdalene hearing those words, or hearing about them, and I wonder what they meant to someone who had herself been restored, who had personally experienced something being lifted from her. What the historical and archaeological picture gives us, when we put it all together, is a woman shaped by very specific forces, a prosperous but taxed and politically pressured community, a deeply Jewish faith and practice, a personal experience of suffering and healing, and a social world that did not easily make room for women to act publicly and independently. Against all of that backdrop, Her choice to join Jesus' traveling movement and support it financially reads not as a casual decision, but as a deliberate, even costly one. She Elizabeth Schussler. Fiorenza, the feminist biblical scholar whose work in memory of her has been widely read since 1983, has argued that the women in the early Jesus movement represented a genuine break from the expected social patterns of their world, that their presence and participation was itself a kind of proclamation. I find that reading entirely consistent with what the historical sources show us about first-century Galilee. Mary Magdalene was not operating in a world that made her choice easy or obvious. She made it anyway. As we move further into her story, this context is going to matter again and again. The world she came from, the occupied Galilee, the taxed fishing town, the legally constrained female life, the deeply Jewish spiritual formation does not disappear when she joins the movement. It travels with her. It shapes the lens through which she sees everything that follows: the ministry, the miracles, the growing tension between Jesus and the authorities, and eventually the catastrophic events in Jerusalem that she will witness with her own eyes. I want you to carry this world with you as we move forward tonight, because her story makes most sense when we remember where she started. She was not born into ease or privilege. She came from a real place with real pressures, and she made real choices within them. That is what makes her remarkable. Not legend, not myth, but the quiet courage of an actual human life in an actual difficult world. So let that settle around you now as you rest. The Sea of Galilee in the first century, silver in the early morning light, the smell of fish and salt, the sound of a working harbour, a town called Magdala on its western shore, busy and Jewish and taxed and alive with the hopes and anxieties of a people longing for something to change. And somewhere in that town, a woman named Mary, shaped by all of it, marked by suffering, moved by healing, making a decision that would carry her name across 2,000 years of human history. We have set the foundation tonight. We know something of the world she came from. In the chapter ahead, we are going to look more carefully at something that has followed her name like a shadow for centuries. Those two words that appear in Luke chapter 8, the 7 demons. And we are going to read them as honestly and carefully as the ancient texts allow. Rest now. The story continues gently when you are ready. Of all the things attached to Mary Magdalene's name across 2,000 years of telling and retelling, nothing has done more lasting damage than 2 small words in a single verse: 7 demons. I want to spend this chapter with you, sitting right there, in that phrase, looking at it from every angle the ancient sources allow. Because what the texts actually say is far more careful and far more limited than what centuries of popular imagination have made of it. And I think when we read it honestly, without the layers of interpretation piled on top, we find something that is not scandalous or shameful at all. We find the trace of a human being who suffered something profound and who was released from it. That is the story the text tells. Everything else, the moral judgments, the assumptions about her character, the connections to sin and sexuality, those were added later by others, for reasons we will examine as we go. Tonight, I want to clear away that accumulation and sit quietly with what is actually written. Let me begin with the text itself, because that is always the right place to start. The Gospel of Luke, in chapter 8, verse 2, describes Mary Magdalene simply as someone from whom 7 demons had gone out. That is the complete statement. There is no description of what the demons caused her to do. There is no account of her behavior during the affliction. There is no suggestion that her suffering was the result of moral failure. The verse moves on immediately. She and other women traveled with Jesus and supported him financially. The Gospel of Mark repeats the same phrase about 7 demons in chapter 16, verse 9, with no additional detail. 2 occurrences in 2 Gospels, and in both cases the information is given, and then the narrative moves forward without dwelling on it, without explaining it, without connecting it to anything that might carry moral weight. The ancient writers recorded this fact about her past, and then apparently felt no need to make more of it than it was. It is we, the readers, across the centuries, who have made more of it. And I think it is worth asking why. Here is something I find genuinely helpful when thinking about that phrase, 7 demons. And it requires us to think about how numbers worked in the Hebrew scriptural tradition. Numbers in the ancient Jewish world were not always purely mathematical. They carried symbolic and theological meaning that a first-century reader would have recognized immediately. The number 7, in particular, appears throughout the Hebrew scriptures as a symbol of completeness or wholeness. You see it in the 7 days of creation in Genesis, in the 7-fold vengeance described in places like Proverbs chapter 26, verse 16, in the 7-branched menorah of the temple. When Luke uses the number 7 to describe Mary's affliction, he may well be communicating not a literal count of individual spirits, but a sense of totality. That whatever she suffered from, it had taken hold of her completely, had filled her entirely. And if that is how we read it, then the healing from 7 demons becomes something equally total, a complete restoration, a full return to wholeness. John Meyer, in his careful scholarly work, A Marginal Jew, and Graham Twelftree, who wrote Jesus the Exorcist, both help us understand that healing and exorcism accounts in the Gospels follow recognizable patterns from the ancient Jewish world. Patterns that communicate restoration and divine power, not moral biography. Now I want to be honest with you about something slightly complicated. The second occurrence of this phrase, in Mark chapter 16, verse 9, comes from what textual scholars call the longer ending of Mark. And this is where we need to be careful, because this section of Mark's Gospel, from verse 9 through verse 20, does not appear in the oldest and most reliable manuscripts of the New Testament that we have. 2 of the most important early manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, both dating to the 4th century, end Mark's Gospel at chapter 16, verse 8, without the material that follows. Most biblical scholars today are confident that the longer ending was added to Mark at a later date, after the Gospel was originally composed. This does not mean the information it contains is necessarily false, but it does mean we should hold it with appropriate care and not treat it as having the same textual standing as the rest of the Gospel. When I mention Mary Magdalene and 7 demons, I am primarily drawing on Luke chapter 8, verse 2, which stands on much firmer ground. What strikes me as particularly significant is what the text does not say. I have read these passages many times, and in none of them does the text use the word sinner in connection with Mary Magdalene. None of them describe her as a prostitute. None of them connect her affliction to sexual behavior, to moral failure, to any violation of religious law. The unnamed woman in Luke chapter 7, the one who washes Jesus' feet with her tears and ointment, is described in that passage as a woman in the city who was a sinner. That woman is a completely different person, appearing in a completely different chapter, never identified by name. The connection between that unnamed sinful woman and Mary Magdalene is not made anywhere in the canonical Gospels. It was made, as we will explore in the next chapter, by a 6th century pope in a sermon. But it is not in the text. And I think it matters enormously that we know that, because the popular image of Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute rests entirely on that later connection, not on anything the New Testament actually says about her. Let me share with you how the 3rd century Christian thinker Origen understood Mary's healing, because I find his approach genuinely thoughtful. Origen was one of the earliest and most influential biblical interpreters in Christian history, and when he reflected on the healing from demons that Mary experienced, he understood it in allegorical and restorative terms, as a movement from spiritual darkness into light, from fragmentation into wholeness. He did not connect it to sexual sin. He did not use it to make her a figure of moral warning. He read it as a story of divine grace, full stop. This early interpretation, which predates Gregory the Great's problematic sermon by more than 3 centuries, aligns much more naturally with what the text itself actually says. And it aligns with the broader pattern we see in Luke's Gospel, where healing consistently signals restoration to full personhood and full participation in community, not rescue from moral corruption. Think of the bent woman in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17, whom Jesus heals on the Sabbath and calls a daughter of Abraham. The language of healing in Luke's Gospel is the language of dignity restored. So what would it have meant in the 1st century world to be someone suffering from what the Gospel writers called demonic affliction? The scholar John Meyer helps us understand that the ancient Jewish world had a developed framework for thinking about forces that could overwhelm a person, drawn from texts like the book of 1st Enoch, which described fallen spiritual beings operating in the world. Within this framework, certain kinds of suffering, particularly those that seem to strip a person of their normal capacity to function, to be present, to be themselves, could be understood as something more than ordinary illness. Whatever Mary Magdalene experienced, it was clearly serious enough that its ending was considered significant enough to be recorded and remembered. And its ending came through Jesus. That is the fact the text gives us. A woman suffered. She was healed. She chose to follow the one who had healed her. The motivation is entirely understandable on purely human terms, and the text asks us to understand it on exactly those terms. I think about how Mary herself might have carried this part of her story, not as shame, but as testimony. In the ancient world, having been healed was not something to hide. It was evidence of divine favor and power. The healing stories scattered throughout the Gospels are consistently presented as signs, as demonstrations of something true about Jesus and about God. Mary Magdalene's healing was part of that story. She was part of that testimony. And the way the Gospel writers remember her, always listed first among the women, always present at the crucial moments, suggests that her community did not read her past as a disqualification. They read it as part of who she was, someone who had known suffering, known restoration, and chosen to give everything she had to the movement that had changed her life. As we begin to move toward the end of this chapter, I want to bring you back to something very simple and very grounding. The facts we have about Mary Magdalene from the canonical texts, the texts included in the Bible, are these. She was from Magdala. She had been healed of something described as 7 demons. She traveled with Jesus in Galilee. She contributed financially to his ministry, and she was present at his crucifixion his burial, and his resurrection. That is what the text gives us. It is less dramatic than the legends, perhaps. But it is also, when you think about it, the story of someone who experienced one of the most difficult things a human being can experience, losing herself to something, and then found her way back, and then gave the rest of her life to the thing that had restored her. I find that genuinely moving, not as a cautionary tale, as a human story. So rest now with that picture in your mind. Not a sinful woman rescued from a shameful life, but a suffering woman restored to wholeness, who responded with loyalty and generosity and presence. The text is quieter than the legend, but it is also truer, and I think its quietness is part of its beauty. What comes next in our story is perhaps the most consequential wrong turn in the entire 2,000-year reading of Mary Magdalene's life. A sermon preached in Rome in the year 591 by a man named Gregory, who looked at 3 different women in 3 different gospel passages and decided, for reasons that made pastoral sense to him at the time, that they were all the same person. The damage that decision caused took more than 1,000 years to even begin to correct. And that is where we are headed next. Sometimes, a single moment in history can send a very long shadow forward through time, shaping how millions of people understand something for generation after generation. Not because the moment was dramatic or violent, but simply because it came from a voice of authority, and the people who came after accepted it without checking the original sources. Tonight, I want to tell you about one of those moments. It happened in Rome in the year 591, in the middle of a plague that was killing people across the city. A man named Gregory, who would become one of the most influential popes in the history of the Catholic Church, stood up to preach. And in that sermon, number 33 of his collected homilies, he made a claim that was not supported by the biblical text. He fused 3 separate women from 3 different gospel passages into one composite figure. And the name he gave to that composite figure was Mary Magdalene. What followed from that single homily was more than 14 centuries of misreading. And the woman who actually appears in the ancient texts was buried beneath a character that was never, in any strict sense, her. Let me walk you through exactly what Gregory said and where he went wrong, because the details matter here. In his homily, Gregory identified Mary Magdalene with 2 other women from the Gospels. First, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, who appears in the Gospel of John in chapters 11 and 12. And second, the unnamed woman described in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50, who comes to Jesus while he is dining at a Pharisee's house, washes his feet with her tears, wipes them with her hair, and anoints them with ointment. Gregory looked at these 3 women, the healed Magdalene, the devoted sister from Bethany, and the unnamed penitent in Luke 7, and he decided they were all the same person. On one level, you can see a kind of homiletic logic at work. All 3 are associated with ointment or tears, or devoted attention to Jesus, and a composite figure combining repentance, devotion, and resurrection witness would make for a compelling sermon character. But the problem is that the text does not support it. These are 3 distinct women, and the Bible never identifies them as the same person. Think about who Mary of Bethany actually is in the Gospels. She is introduced in the Gospel of John as the sister of Lazarus, the man Jesus raises from the dead in John chapter 11. She has a named sister, Martha. She has a specific home in the village of Bethany near Jerusalem. She is a developed character in her own right, with her own conversations with Jesus, her own moment of grief and faith at her brother's tomb. She and her family are clearly known to Jesus as close friends. The text says explicitly in John chapter 11, verse 5, that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. This is a woman with a name, a family, a location, and a distinct story. She is not Mary Magdalene, who comes from Galilee, has no named family in any gospel, and is never associated with the village of Bethany or the family of Lazarus. The two women exist in entirely different geographic and narrative contexts in the biblical text. Gregory's conflation required ignoring these differences. And then there is the unnamed woman in Luke chapter 7, the one whose action of washing Jesus' feet with her tears is described so vividly and movingly in that passage. I want to be clear about something. She is described in the text as a woman in the city who was a sinner. The Pharisee who invites Jesus to dinner refers to her that way. The text does not specify what kind of sinner she was. The word used in Greek is simply hamartolos, which means one who misses the mark, who falls short of the law's requirements. It does not say she was a prostitute. That was an additional interpretation layered onto Luke chapter 7 by later readers. What we do know is that she is unnamed. The text offers no name for her whatsoever, and crucially, she appears one full chapter before Luke introduces Mary Magdalene in chapter 8. Luke, who was a careful writer, introduces Mary Magdalene in chapter 8 as if for the first time, giving her name and her identifying description, which makes absolutely no sense if she had already appeared, unnamed, in chapter 7. A careful reading of Luke's gospel itself argues against Gregory's conflation. The historian Catherine Ludwig Jansen, in her deeply researched book, The Making of the Magdalene, published in 2000, traces exactly how Gregory's composite figure took hold and spread through Western Christianity. And what she shows is that once Gregory had made this identification from his position of enormous ecclesiastical authority, it became the received tradition in the Latin West. It was repeated in sermons, embedded in liturgical texts, painted onto chapel walls, and assumed in theological education for century after century. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted it, a fact I find quietly important. Eastern Christianity maintained from early on that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed penitent woman of Luke 7 were three distinct individuals, and the Eastern tradition honored Mary Magdalene specifically as equal to the apostles, a title that carries no association with sexual sin or social disgrace. But in the West, Gregory's homily won out, and a woman who appears in the biblical text as a healed disciple and resurrection witness was recast as the universal symbol of repentant sexuality. The gap between the text and the tradition had never been wider. Now here is something worth considering about why Gregory might have made this choice, and I want to be fair to him even as I note the error. The year was 591. Rome was experiencing a devastating outbreak of plague. People were dying. Gregory was a pastor trying to reach people in crisis with a message that spoke to their condition. A figure who combined all the dimensions of devotion, the deep repentance of the Luke 7 woman, the contemplative devotion of Mary of Bethany, the fearless witness of Mary Magdalene at the resurrection, would have been a powerful homiletic tool. A single woman who had fallen to the lowest place and risen to the highest witness could speak to everyone. The composite Mary Magdalene was not born from malice. She was born from pastoral pragmatism, but pastoral pragmatism applied to biblical texts with insufficient care for what those texts actually say can cause lasting damage, and in this case, it did. Gregory's intention may have been to inspire. His method was to misread, and the woman in the text paid the price. What I find almost difficult to believe when I sit with the historical record is how long it took for the institutional church in the West to formally correct this error. The Eastern Church had never made it. Individual scholars over the centuries occasionally noted the problems with the conflation, but the Roman Catholic Church did not formally separate the three women in its official liturgical calendar until the reforms of 1969, nearly 14 centuries after Gregory preached his homily. And even then, the correction came quietly, embedded in revisions to the Roman Missal, without the same kind of public prominence that Gregory's original claim had carried. The scholar Robert Fastiggi, writing in the New Catholic Encyclopedia, discusses these liturgical changes, though the specific wording of the Reform Decree is something I would encourage you to look up directly, rather than take solely from secondary sources. What is clear is that by the middle of the 20th century, biblical scholarship had thoroughly established the distinction between the three women, and the Church's liturgical practice eventually caught up with what the texts had always shown. There is something that moves me about the Eastern Orthodox tradition's handling of this. The Orthodox Church celebrates Mary Magdalene's feast day on July 22nd and honors her with the title equal to the apostles, is apostolos in Greek. This is the highest honor the Eastern tradition grants to figures outside the apostolic period itself. It has been applied to people like Constantine's mother, Helena, and to the missionary who brought Christianity to Georgia. And it was applied to Mary Magdalene, based on her role as the first witness and announcer of the resurrection. There is no shadow of the penitent prostitute in the Orthodox understanding of her. She is, simply and fully, the woman who stood at the tomb and carried the news of resurrection to the disciples. That reading has been there all along in the Eastern churches, waiting for the Western tradition to find its way back to the same conclusion. The good news, and there genuinely is good news here, is that the 20th and 21st centuries have seen a genuine scholarly and ecclesiastical reckoning with this history. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day in the Catholic Church from a memorial to a feast, bringing it to the same liturgical level as the feasts of the apostles themselves. A formal decree from the Congregation for Divine Worship accompanied this change, and an accompanying essay by Archbishop Rino Fisichella reflected on her apostolic significance. This was not a radical new claim. It was the Western Church catching up with what the Gospel texts had always shown and what the Eastern tradition had always maintained. But it was real, and it mattered. It meant that the institution, which had most widely spread Gregory's misidentification, was now, slowly and formally, working to undo it. As you settle into rest tonight, I want to leave you with a thought that I find both sobering and encouraging. The story of Gregory's sermon is a reminder that even the most authoritative voices can misread ancient texts, and that misreadings can persist for an extraordinarily long time when they are not checked against the primary sources. But it is also a reminder that truth has a kind of patience to it, that the text remains, that scholars keep reading it, and that eventually the accumulation of careful, honest attention can begin to correct even very old mistakes. Mary Magdalene waited 14 centuries for the Latin West to formally acknowledge that she was not who Gregory said she was. And in the chapters ahead, we are going to return to the Gospels themselves, all four of them, and look carefully at what they actually record about her. Because if Gregory's composite figure is not the real Mary Magdalene, we need to ask, who is? The texts have an answer, and it is time to let them speak. Tonight I want to do something that may seem simple, but that I find surprisingly powerful when you actually sit down and do it carefully. I want to read through all 4 Gospels and collect every single thing they say about Mary Magdalene, just the facts, from the texts, in sequence. No legend, no interpretation layered on from outside, no Gregory, just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, telling us what they saw fit to record about this woman. I have done this kind of careful reading many times, and I want to share with you what emerges when you lay it all out. What you find is not a minor background figure. What you find is someone who appears at the most significant moments in the entire gospel narrative, and who appears consistently across 4 independently composed accounts, as a named and remembered presence at every one of those moments. That kind of consistent, multi-source attestation is exactly what historians look for when they want to establish that a figure in ancient texts was genuinely remembered and genuinely significant. And Mary Magdalene passes that test in remarkable fashion. Let me begin with the Gospel of Matthew, because I want us to move through these accounts one at a time and give each one its proper attention. Matthew chapter 27, verses 55 and 56. It introduces Mary Magdalene in the context of the crucifixion. The text tells us that many women were watching from a distance as Jesus died on the cross, and it names 3 of them: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Then it adds something worth pausing on. It says these women had followed Jesus from Galilee and had ministered to him. The Greek word used there for ministered is diakoneo, the same root from which we get the word deacon. It is a word that in the early church carried real weight, describing service and leadership within the community. Matthew is telling us, at the moment of the crucifixion, that these women had been with Jesus from the very beginning, from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. They were not late arrivals or casual observers. They were part of the movement from the start. And Mary Magdalene is listed first. Matthew continues. In chapter 27, verse 61, he records that after Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in a tomb and rolled a stone in front of it, 2 women sat opposite the tomb, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. They were watching. They were noting where the body was laid. They stayed when everyone else had gone. And then in chapter 28, verses 1 through 10, Matthew records the resurrection morning. The 2 Marys come to look at the tomb. They encounter an angel. They are told that Jesus has risen, and then the risen Jesus himself meets them on the road. Matthew says they took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And Jesus sends them with a message to the disciples. This is Matthew's account, relatively brief, but clear. Mary Magdalene is there at the death, at the burial, at the empty tomb, and at the first resurrection encounter. She is a consistent presence through the entire Passion narrative. Mark's Gospel tells a similar story, with its own particular details. Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, introduces the women at the crucifixion with language remarkably similar to Matthew. They had followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee. Mary Magdalene is named first again. Mark chapter 15, verse 47, notes that she and Mary, the mother of Joses, observed where Jesus was buried. Then in chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, the original ending of Mark, the part we can be most confident about, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James. She and Salome come to the tomb early in the morning, bringing spices to anoint the body. They find the stone rolled away. They enter the tomb, and a young man in a white robe tells them that Jesus has risen. The text says they fled, trembling and astonished. And here Mark's original gospel ends, abruptly, breathtakingly without a resurrection appearance, leaving the reader with that silence and that open tomb. Mary Magdalene is at the center of it, trembling with the news. Luke, as we have already discussed, introduces Mary Magdalene earlier than the other Gospels, back in chapter 8. But he also places her at the crucifixion and the resurrection. Luke chapter 23, verse 49, notes that those who knew Jesus, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. And chapter 23, verses 55 and 56, records that the women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then in chapter 24, verse 10, Luke names the women who reported the resurrection to the 11 disciples: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. Richard Bauckham, in his careful study of how names function in the gospel traditions, notes that these women are named because they were known, because they were the actual sources for the traditions being recorded, because real communities remembered them as real people. The naming is not decorative, it is historical testimony. Now we come to John's Gospel, and here the account of Mary Magdalene is the richest and most extended of any of the 4 evangelists. John chapter 19, verse 25, places her at the foot of the cross itself, not watching from a distance, as Matthew and Mark describe, but standing directly at the site of the crucifixion. John chapter 20, verse 1, opens the resurrection account with Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb alone, while it was still dark. She finds the stone moved, runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, and then returns to the tomb after they have come and gone. What follows in John chapter 20, verses 11 through 18, is the most intimate and extended post-resurrection encounter in any of the 4 Gospels, and it belongs entirely to Mary Magdalene. She stands outside the tomb, weeping. She looks inside and sees 2 angels. She turns and sees a figure she does not recognize. She thinks it is the gardener. Then he speaks her name. In that single spoken name, Mary, everything changes, and she knows who it is. Her response is the Aramaic word, Rabboni, which John's Gospel helpfully translates for its readers as meaning teacher. But the scholar Raymond Brown, in his exhaustive 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of John, published in 1970, helps us understand that Rabboni is actually an intensified form of rabbi, something closer to my great teacher or my dear teacher, a form that carries warmth and personal devotion beyond the standard term of address. It is an intimate word. It is the word of someone who knows the person they are speaking to very well. And it tells us something about the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene that the rest of the Gospels, with their briefer accounts, do not fully convey. This was not a casual acquaintance. This was someone who had followed him from Galilee, who had stayed when others fled, who had come to the tomb in the dark while it was still night, and whose voice he called by name at the moment of resurrection. The Gospel of John gives us this scene, and it is extraordinary. What I find remarkable when I step back and look at all 4 Gospels together is the consistency. 4 texts composed by different authors, drawing on different sources, writing for different communities. And in all 4 of them, Mary Magdalene is present at the crucifixion. In all 4, she is among the first to know that the tomb is empty. She is listed first in the resurrection accounts, or she stands alone at the center of the most detailed one. The biblical scholar Richard Bauckham has written about what he calls the criterion of embarrassment as it applies to the women witnesses. In the 1st century world, where women's testimony carried so little legal weight, The fact that all four Gospels place women, and specifically Mary Magdalene, as the first witnesses to the resurrection is a strong argument for the historical reliability of that tradition. No one inventing a resurrection story for a first-century Jewish audience would have chosen a woman as the primary witness. The fact that she is there consistently in all four accounts suggests that she was genuinely there, and that the early Christian communities knew it and would not erase it even when it was socially inconvenient. There is one gap in the canonical picture that scholars have noted and that I think is worth naming, honestly. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, gives what many consider the earliest written account of resurrection appearances, and Mary Magdalene does not appear in it. Paul lists Cephas, that is, Peter, then the 12, then 500 brothers and sisters, then James, then all the apostles, and finally himself. No women are mentioned at all. Why? This has been a subject of genuine scholarly debate. Some suggest Paul was listing only those whose testimony would carry weight in the communities he was addressing. Others see it as evidence of the tension between different streams of early tradition. What I can say is simply that Paul's list and the gospel accounts are both ancient sources, and they tell us different things, and the honest response is to note the difference and sit with the question rather than pretend it does not exist. As this chapter draws to its close, I want you to hold the complete picture in your mind. Not Gregory's composite, not the legend, not the popular image, but the woman who actually appears across the pages of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. She followed Jesus from Galilee. She supported his ministry. She stood at the cross. She watched where he was buried. She came to the tomb before dawn. She wept outside it. She heard her name spoken, and she ran to tell the others what she had seen and heard. That is the biblical Mary Magdalene, drawn from the texts themselves. In the chapter ahead, we are going to stay in that garden. We are going to sit with that extraordinary moment in John chapter 20, when Jesus speaks her name and she recognizes him. Because that scene, when we read it slowly and carefully, is one of the most quietly remarkable passages in all of ancient literature. Allow yourself to rest now, carrying that picture gently as the night settles around you. I want to take you somewhere very specific tonight. I want to take you to a garden outside the walls of Jerusalem, in the grey and still hour before full sunrise on a Sunday morning, nearly 2,000 years ago. The air would have been cool, the light uncertain, the city behind the walls still largely asleep. And in that garden, according to the Gospel of John, chapter 20, a woman stood alone outside a tomb and wept. What happens in the next few minutes, as John records it, is the most intimate and fully drawn resurrection encounter in the entire New Testament. And it happens not to Peter, not to the beloved disciple, not to any of the 12 men who had traveled with Jesus across Galilee and Judea. It happens to Mary Magdalene. I find this passage, every time I return to it, to be something almost breathtaking in its quietness. There is no crowd here, no dramatic speech, no theological lecture, just a woman weeping in a garden, a name spoken in the air, and a recognition that changed everything. Let me walk through it with you tonight, slowly, as it deserves. John's account of that morning begins in verse 1 of chapter 20, and John is doing something here that creates a slightly different picture from the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In those three accounts, multiple women come to the tomb together, but in John, Mary Magdalene comes alone, while it was still dark. The Greek word John uses for dark is skosias, and it carries more weight than just a description of the time of day. Darkness in John's Gospel often carries theological meaning. It is the domain of confusion, of not yet seeing, of the world before understanding breaks through. She comes in the dark, and what she discovers sends her running. She sees that the stone has been removed from the tomb's entrance, and her immediate conclusion, the only reasonable conclusion for someone who had watched the burial just 2 days before, is that someone has taken the body. She runs to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one John describes as beloved to Jesus, and she says to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." The "we" is interesting. It may be a trace of the tradition that others were present, even in John's more solitary account. Peter and the other disciple run to the tomb. John records the small human detail that the other disciple outruns Peter, gets there first, but pauses at the entrance, and Peter, characteristically, goes straight in. They see the burial cloths lying there and the face cloth rolled up in a place by itself. The text says the other disciple saw and believed, though John adds, in verse 9, that as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. And then, this is the detail I want you to notice, they go back to their homes. They leave. Mary Magdalene, who had run to tell them and presumably followed them back to the tomb, remains. After Peter and the beloved disciple have gone, she is still there, standing outside, weeping. There is something in this image that moves me deeply every time I sit with it. The men came, they looked, they left. She stayed. She stoops to look into the tomb, and she sees something the men apparently did not. 2 figures in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the feet. They ask her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she says, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." She is still in the mode of loss, still oriented around an absent body, a stolen burial, a grief without resolution. She turns around and she sees someone standing nearby. She does not recognize him. John tells us she supposes him to be the gardener. And this detail, the misrecognition, is one of the most humanly authentic moments in any resurrection account. She is not in a state of expectant readiness, poised for a miraculous encounter. She is exhausted, grieving, confused, looking for a body, not for a risen figure. Her eyes are blurred with tears. Her mind is full of loss. She sees a man standing in the garden near a tomb, and she thinks, "Gardener." He asks her the same question the angels asked. "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And she, still in her assumption, says to this figure she does not know, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." The request is touching in its practicality. She does not have a plan for what to do with the body if she found it. She is simply determined to find it, to tend to it, to not let her teacher be lost. And then the text does something so simple, it almost takes your breath away. The figure speaks one word, Mary, and everything changes. Raymond Brown, in his commentary on John's Gospel, reflects on this moment with the observation that the shepherd knows his sheep by name, and that this moment echoes the image from John chapter 10, where Jesus says, "His sheep hear his voice and know it." She hears her name spoken in a familiar voice, and she knows exactly who it is. She turns and she says, "Rabboni." That word, Rabboni, carries more weight than a simple greeting. As the scholar Raymond Brown explains in his detailed study, It is an Aramaic intensification of rabbi, the standard term of address for a teacher. But Rabboni adds something personal. She's something warmer, something that carries both reverence and intimacy. John's Gospel translates it for its Greek-speaking readers simply as teacher, but the Aramaic word behind it speaks of deep personal connection, something like, my own dear teacher. Sandra Schneiders, in her theological reading of John's Gospel, called Written That You May Believe, reflects on what Mary's recognition in this moment reveals, that the relationship between Jesus and this particular disciple was not abstract or impersonal. She knew his voice the way someone knows the voice of a person they love and have listened to for years. And when she hears it, she knows it immediately. Now Jesus says something to her that has puzzled readers for centuries, and I want to spend a moment with it because it is genuinely important. He says, in the Latin translation that became famous, "Noli me tangere," do not hold on to me. The Greek word here is haptu, which can mean to touch or to cling to. The full sentence in John 20 verse 17 is, do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. This has sometimes been read as Jesus pushing Mary away, rejecting her touch, distancing himself from her. But most careful readers of this passage, and Sandra Schneiders is particularly good on this point, understand it differently. The grammar suggests not, do not touch me, but rather, do not cling to me, or stop holding on to me, implying that she may have already reached for him, and that what he is correcting is not the impulse of affection, but the impulse to hold the moment in place, to return to the old relationship. The resurrection has changed things. She cannot hold on to what was before. She must go and tell. And this is the moment where the garden scene becomes not just a story of personal reunion, but a story of commission. Jesus does not simply reassure her that he is alive. He gives her a task. Go to my brothers and say to them. This is a formal sending, an apostolic sending. The word apostle in Greek simply means one who is sent. And here, in John chapter 20, verse 17, Mary Magdalene is sent with a specific message to a specific group of people. The early church father, Hippolytus of Rome, writing around the year 230, recognized this commissioning for what it was, and he gave her the title that has followed her ever since. Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. I find it quietly extraordinary that this title appears in the 3rd century, long before the medieval period, long before modern feminist scholarship, simply as an honest reading of what John chapter 20 actually records. She was sent. She went. She told them. That is the definition of an apostle. What do we make of this scene theologically across different traditions? I think it is worth acknowledging that the garden encounter in John chapter 20 has been read through many different lenses over the centuries, and not all of those readings are identical. What strikes me, though, is how many of them converge on a common recognition that Mary Magdalene in this scene is not a peripheral figure or a grateful bystander. She is the first to see, the first to hear, the first to be commissioned, and the first to carry the news. The biblical scholar Sandra Schneiders writes about the significance of her being alone with Jesus in this moment, the intimacy of it, the personal nature of the commissioning, and she reads it as John's way of giving Mary Magdalene a role in the resurrection narrative that parallels and in some ways exceeds that of Peter and the beloved disciple, who saw the empty tomb but did not see the risen Jesus. The garden is her space. The name spoken in the air is her name. The commission is hers. As we come to the end of this chapter, I want to leave you resting in the image of that garden, in that quiet morning with the darkness just beginning to give way to light. A woman stood at a tomb and wept for someone she loved and had lost. She was asked why she wept, and she did not yet know the answer. She thought she was weeping for a stolen body, but she was actually standing at the threshold of something that would change the shape of human history. And then her name was spoken in a familiar voice, and she knew. She turned. She reached. She said, Rabboni. And then she was sent. What she carried from that garden was not just news. It was the first proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus, the event at the very center of the Christian faith. She carried it, she delivered it, and the ancient writers remembered that she did. In the chapter that follows, we are going to explore what happened when she brought that news to the disciples, and what their response to her testimony reveals about the world she was navigating, and about how her role was understood in those early and extraordinary days. There is a moment right after the garden encounter in John chapter 20 that I want to sit with you in tonight, because it is a moment that contains within it a very old and very human tension. Mary Magdalene has just experienced something extraordinary. She has seen, she has heard, she has been commissioned. And now she walks away from the garden, carrying the most significant news anyone had ever been asked to carry. And she goes to tell the people who were closest to Jesus, the disciples, the inner circle, the men who had traveled with him and eaten with him and called him teacher. She tells them everything, and what happens next, depending on which gospel you read, is either a silence or an outright rejection. The men do not believe her. I find this one of the most honest moments in all of ancient religious writing. Not because disbelief is admirable, but because the writers recorded it anyway, when they could easily have smoothed it over. They told the truth about how the news of the resurrection was first received. And that truth involves a woman who told it and men who doubted her. Let me read you the words as Luke records them, because they are plain and they deserve to be heard plainly. In Luke chapter 24, verse 11, and after the women return from the tomb and tell the 11 disciples and all the others everything they have seen and heard, the text says, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. The Greek phrase translated idle tale is leros, a word that in the ancient world meant nonsense, babbling, the kind of talk you dismiss without engaging. This is not a gentle skepticism. This is a flat rejection. The disciples heard the testimony of Mary Magdalene and the other women who had been at the tomb, and they categorized it as babbling. The longer ending of Mark, which, as we discussed in an earlier chapter, is a later addition to that gospel, similarly records in chapter 16, verses 10 and 11, that when Mary reported to those who had been with Jesus that she had seen him alive, for they would not believe it. Two gospel traditions, however different their textual standing, agree on this basic fact. The women's testimony was not accepted. Now here is something the historian in me finds genuinely interesting about this detail. In the first century Jewish world, as the historian Josephus records in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 8, women were not permitted to offer testimony in civil legal proceedings. Their word was not considered legally valid in the same institutional way that a man's was. This was not a uniquely Jewish attitude. Roman law had similar structures, and the broader Mediterranean world generally operated within a framework that gave far less formal credibility to women's testimony. When the disciples hear Mary Magdalene's report and dismiss it as idle talk, they are responding in a way that, however wrong it may seem to us today, was entirely consistent with the cultural assumptions of their time and world. I want to be careful here not to make them simply villains. They were shaped by their world as we are shaped by ours. But I also want to be clear. The texts do not excuse the dismissal. They simply record it, and the recording itself is part of the testimony. What makes the disciples' disbelief particularly striking is that the women who reported this were not unknown figures making unverifiable claims. Mary Magdalene had traveled with these men across Galilee. She had been present at the crucifixion when many of them had not. She had watched where the body was buried. She was a known, trusted member of the same community. And the scholar Richard Bauckham, in his work Gospel Women, makes a point I find compelling. The fact that women are named as the primary witnesses in the resurrection tradition is, from a historical standpoint, actually an argument for the reliability of that tradition. No one composing a story for persuasive purposes in the first century world would have chosen women as the first and primary witnesses to the most important event in their narrative. The women are in the story because they were actually there. The embarrassment of their testimony being dismissed is in the story because it actually happened. And Mary Magdalene is named first because she was genuinely first. Let me tell you about a title that was given to Mary Magdalene by a theologian writing around the year 230, a title that captures exactly what the gospel texts show her doing in those hours after the garden. Hippolytus of Rome was one of the early church's most prolific writers and thinkers, and in his commentary on the Song of Songs, passages 24 through 26, he explicitly calls Mary Magdalene Apostola Apostolorum, apostle to the apostles. This is not a casual compliment. In the early church's understanding, an apostle was someone who had witnessed the risen Christ and been sent to proclaim that witness. The Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, describes the qualifications for apostleship in functional terms. The person must have been with Jesus from the beginning and must be a witness to his resurrection. Mary Magdalene meets both criteria. She had followed Jesus from Galilee. She was the first to see him risen. She was explicitly sent with a message. Hippolytus was simply reading the text of John chapter 20 and calling what he saw by its proper name. The title, Apostle to the Apostles, did not disappear with Hippolytus. It resurfaced in the 12th century in the writings of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, who also used it in reference to Mary Magdalene. And in 2016, far more recently, Pope Francis formally elevated her feast day in the Catholic liturgical calendar to the same level as the feasts of the apostles, with an accompanying statement acknowledging her apostolic role. The Congregation for Divine Worship issued a decree explaining this change, and Archbishop Rino Fisichella wrote an explanatory essay connecting her role in John chapter 20 to the tradition of apostolic witness. This is a thread that runs from the 3rd century through the 12th century through the 21st century. The consistent recognition by careful readers of the gospel text that what Mary Magdalene did on resurrection morning was apostolic in the fullest sense of the word. The title was always there in the text. It just took a long time for all of the traditions to fully acknowledge it. Now I want to address something that careful readers of the New Testament sometimes notice, and that deserves honest engagement. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, Paul gives what many scholars consider the earliest written account of resurrection appearances. And he does not mention Mary Magdalene. He lists Peter, then the 12, then 500 at once, then James, then all the apostles, and then himself. No women appear anywhere in the list. This has been the subject of genuine scholarly debate for a long time, and I do not think there is a simple resolution to it. Some scholars suggest Paul was listing only those whose testimony would carry legal and social weight in the communities he was addressing, witnesses who could be publicly cited. Others read it as reflecting a different stream of the early tradition, one centered on the Galilean and Jerusalem male disciples. What I think we can say, honestly, is that Paul's list and the gospel accounts are both ancient, both valuable, and they tell us different things about how the resurrection was remembered in different early Christian communities. The gap between them is real, and it is one of those places where intellectual honesty requires us to sit with the question rather than pretend the tension does not exist. What strikes me most when I hold all of this together is the way the texts themselves preserve the story of Mary Magdalene's testimony without endorsing the dismissal she received. The gospel writers record that the disciples did not believe her, but they also record that she was right. She told them Jesus was risen. She was right. She told them she had seen him. She was right. She carried the news faithfully and accurately. The validation of her testimony came not through the disciples' acceptance, but through what followed. Through the appearances to Peter, to the 12, to all the others that Luke and John and Paul describe in the days that followed. And in every account that looks back on that morning, Mary Magdalene stands at the beginning of the chain. The apostle to the apostles was not a title invented by later admirers to honor an obscure figure. It was a recognition of what the story itself plainly shows. I also find something worth sitting with in the Eastern Orthodox tradition's handling of this. The Orthodox Church has, from its earliest centuries, celebrated Mary Magdalene with the title equal to the apostles, is apostolos in Greek, the highest honor the tradition grants to figures outside the apostolic period itself. This title has been given to missionaries who brought Christianity to entire nations. It has been given to rulers who transformed their kingdoms. And it was given to Mary Magdalene, and based on nothing more and nothing less than an honest reading of what happened in that garden and in the hours that followed. The Eastern Church never got caught in Gregory's conflation, never draped the image of the penitent sinner over the apostolic witness, and so perhaps it was easier for that tradition to see clearly what the text had always been saying. The apostle to the apostles was there in the gospel all along, waiting to be seen. As we close this chapter and move toward rest, I want you to carry with you the image of Mary Magdalene walking away from the garden, carrying news that the world was not quite ready to receive, delivering it faithfully anyway, and being dismissed by the very people she was sent to reach. And then I want you to hold alongside that image the long arc of history that slowly, over centuries, I came to recognize what she had done and what she was. From Hippolytus in the 3rd century, to Bernard in the 12th, to Pope Francis in the 21st. The recognition kept returning because the text kept saying the same thing. She was sent. She went. She told them. What happens next in our story takes us in a very different direction, away from the canonical Gospels and into a remarkable cache of ancient texts that were buried in the Egyptian desert and not discovered until 1945. Those texts tell a story about Mary Magdalene that is quite different from anything we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And they are worth knowing about, carefully, honestly, and with clear eyes. I want to take you somewhere unexpected tonight, away from the shores of Galilee and the streets of Jerusalem, and into a desert in Upper Egypt. In the year 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near a cliff at a place called Nag Hammadi, looking for fertilizer in the soil when his shovel struck something hard. He had found a sealed clay jar, and inside it were 13 leather-bound papyrus books, codices, containing more than 50 ancient texts written in the Coptic language, the language of early Egyptian Christianity. These texts had been hidden there, scholars believe, sometime in the 4th century, likely buried by monks from a nearby monastery who feared the growing pressure from Orthodox Church authorities to destroy writings that did not conform to accepted doctrine. For 1,600 years, they lay undisturbed in the desert sand, and among them were several texts that mention Mary Magdalene, not as a healed disciple or a resurrection witness, but as something far more central to the story, as the disciple who understood what the others could not, as the one closest to Jesus, as the figure around whom real disputes about authority and spiritual knowledge were played out. Tonight, I want to explore these texts with you honestly, which means being clear about what they are, when they come from, and what they can and cannot tell us. The first thing I want to establish clearly is that these Nag Hammadi texts, along with a related text called the Gospel of Mary, which was found separately in a manuscript known as the Berlin Gnostic Codex, are not part of the biblical canon. They are not included in the New Testament, and they were not included because early Christian communities, through a long and sometimes contested process, determined that they did not belong alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the letters of Paul as authoritative witnesses to the life and teaching of Jesus. The scholar Elaine Pagels, whose book The Gnostic Gospels, published in 1979, brought these texts to wide popular attention, is careful to describe them as products of Gnostic Christian communities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, communities that understood the nature of salvation, knowledge, and spiritual authority in ways that differed significantly from what would become mainstream Christianity. When I describe these texts to you tonight, I will be clear at each step about what kind of source we are dealing with. They are apocryphal texts, ancient, interesting, and historically significant, but not carrying the same weight as the canonical Gospels. With that clearly established, let me tell you what the Gospel of Mary actually says, because it is a remarkable document, and its portrait of Mary Magdalene is unlike anything in the canonical tradition. The Gospel of Mary, which survives in fragmentary form in the Berlin Gnostic Codex, dating paleographically to around the 4th or 5th century, though likely drawing on earlier traditions from the 2nd or 3rd century, presents a scene in which the risen Jesus has spoken privately to Mary Magdalene, giving her visions and teachings that the other disciples have not received. After Jesus departs, the disciples are in a state of grief and fear, and it is Mary who steps forward to comfort them. Peter asks her to share what the Saviour told her privately, since he loved you more than the rest of the women. And Mary shares a vision, a difficult, abstract, deeply Gnostic vision involving the soul's ascent through spiritual powers. When she finishes, Andrew expresses doubt, and then Peter asks sharply, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" These are the words, as the text preserves them, and they are striking in their directness. The conflict is not hidden or softened. Peter's objection is explicitly about gender and authority, and then a disciple named Levi steps in. And this is the moment in the Gospel of Mary that I find most memorable. Levi rebukes Peter. Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her? The Karen King translation of this passage, from her detailed scholarly study, The Gospel of Mary of Magdala, published in 2003, gives us these words in careful academic context. King is one of the leading scholars of these texts, and she is honest about both their significance and their limitations. What she helps us see is that the Gospel of Mary is not a straightforward historical document. It is a theological text composed within a specific Gnostic community, making specific claims about spiritual authority and the transmission of Jesus' teaching. The figure of Mary Magdalene in this text is a symbol as much as a portrait. She represents a kind of spiritual receptivity and insight that the text sets in contrast to Peter's more institutional, more authority-focused approach. Whether this reflects real historical events or real historical disputes, we cannot say with certainty, but it reflects something about the early Christian world. The fact that questions of authority, of who gets to speak, of whose vision counts, were very much alive in those communities. The Gospel of Philip is another Nag Hammadi text that mentions Mary Magdalene, and this is the one that has caused perhaps more popular confusion than any other ancient text in recent decades. The Gospel of Philip, which scholars date to around the 3rd century CE, refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, using the Coptic word koinonos. This word has been translated in various ways, and the translation matters enormously. Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, published in 2003, made the claim that this word meant spouse or wife, and that the text implied a sexual or romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But scholars who have actually studied the text are clear on this point. Koinonos means companion or partner in a general sense. It is not a word that implies marriage or sexual union. Karen King, Elaine Pagels, and other scholars who have worked most carefully with this text are unanimous in rejecting the spousal interpretation. The Gospel of Philip also contains a passage that says Jesus used to kiss her, often on her. But the manuscript is damaged precisely at the crucial word, leaving scholars unable to say where he kissed her. Popular culture filled in that blank with imagination. The text itself leaves it genuinely unresolved. The Pistis Sophia is a longer and more complex Gnostic text, found in a separate manuscript known as the Askew Codex, and it presents perhaps the most expansive portrait of Mary Magdalene in the entire non-canonical tradition. In the Pistis Sophia, Mary is in dialogue with the risen Jesus over an extended series of chapters, asking more questions and providing more answers than all of the other disciples combined. She is described as one who has inherited the light and whose heart is directed toward the kingdom of heaven more than all her brothers. Peter at one point complains to Jesus that Mary speaks too much and that the other disciples cannot get a word in, and Jesus gently corrects him. The portrait is consistently one of a disciple whose spiritual understanding surpasses the others, whose access to the teacher's inner meaning is privileged, and whose authority is contested by the male disciples, but ultimately validated by Jesus himself. Again, I want to be clear. This is a Gnostic theological text, not a historical biography, but it is ancient, and it represents a strand of early Christian reflection on Mary Magdalene that was widespread enough to produce multiple texts across multiple communities. What do we make of all of this, honestly? The scholar Anne Graham Brock, in her book Mary Magdalene, the First Apostle, published in 2003, argues that the tension between Peter and Mary in these non-canonical texts reflects real historical disputes in early Christianity about the nature of apostolic authority, specifically about whether authority flowed from institutional appointment and continuity with the male disciples or from direct spiritual experience and revelation. In that debate, the figure of Mary Magdalene became a symbol for one side, and the figure of Peter became a symbol for the other. I find this interpretive framework genuinely helpful, though I want to be careful. It is an interpretation and a contested one. What we can say more confidently is that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, multiple Christian communities were telling stories in which Mary Magdalene occupied a position of spiritual prominence, and in which her authority was disputed by figures representing more institutional structures. The canonical Gospels give us the starting point for this tradition. The Gnostic texts show us where some strands of that tradition traveled. The physical discovery of these texts at Nag Hammadi in 1945, and the separate discovery of the Berlin Codex containing the Gospel of Mary, which had actually surfaced in the antiquities market in Egypt in 1896 and been published in fragmentary form in the early 20th century, represents one of the most significant archaeological events in the history of early Christian studies. The Nag Hammadi codices were written on papyrus, bound in leather, and sealed in a clay jar, before being buried in the cliffside caves near the ancient town of Chenoboskion. The carbon dating and paleographic analysis of the manuscripts places their physical composition in the 4th century CE, though the underlying Greek originals from which they were translated were likely composed considerably earlier, in many cases in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. When Elaine Pagels brought these texts to popular attention in 1979, she was not exaggerating when she said they changed our picture of early Christianity. They revealed a world of far more diverse theological opinion than the standard church history had often acknowledged. I find it worth pausing to reflect on what it means that communities of early Christians, real people living in real places, trying to understand their faith, chose to preserve and transmit texts that placed Mary Magdalene at the center of the spiritual story. Whatever we think of the theological claims these texts make, they tell us that for some early Christian communities, this woman's name and her authority meant something. They thought she mattered. They wrote about her. They copied her teachings. And when pressure came from the authorities to destroy writings outside the approved tradition, someone, probably monks, probably at the monastery of Saint Pachomius, chose to bury these books rather than burn them. They put them in a jar and buried them in the desert, as if they expected someone might one day want to read them again. And 1600 years later, a farmer's shovel found that jar. I find something quietly remarkable about that long arc of preservation. As we move toward the end of this chapter, I want to be honest with you about what we can and cannot know from these texts. We cannot use the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Philip to fill in biographical details about the real, historical Mary Magdalene. They are theological documents, not eyewitness accounts, composed at least a century after her death. What they can tell us is something about the range of ways early Christians understood and valued her memory. They can show us that the story of her prominence was not a 20th century invention. It was alive in the ancient world, in multiple communities, across multiple texts. And they can show us that the questions raised by her story, questions about whose testimony counts, whose vision is valid, whose voice carries authority, were not merely academic. They were live questions in the first centuries of the Christian faith argued over and written about by real people who felt the stakes deeply. In the chapter ahead, we are going to look more closely at exactly that argument, the tension between Peter and Mary that appears in both canonical and non-canonical sources, and what it might tell us about the world the early church was building. I want to tell you about a tension that runs through the ancient Christian documents like a quiet fault line, something you can trace if you know where to look. From the canonical Gospels through the Gnostic texts we explored last chapter, and into the work of modern scholars who have spent careers trying to understand what the early church actually looked like before its structures and hierarchies became fixed. It is a tension between two kinds of authority. On one side, there is Peter, impulsive, passionate, clearly beloved, designated by Jesus in Matthew chapter 16 as the rock on which the church would be built. On the other side, there is Mary Magdalene, faithful, present, the first witness to the resurrection, explicitly commissioned by the risen Jesus in John chapter 20. Both of these figures are real, and both of their stories are in the ancient texts, and across those texts, in ways that range from subtle to startlingly direct. The question of whose authority takes precedence gets asked again and again without ever receiving a fully clean answer. Tonight, I want to walk through that tension with you, honestly, staying close to what the sources actually say. Let me begin with the canonical Gospels, because the tension begins there, even if it is quieter and more indirect than what we find in the non-canonical texts. In John chapter 20, verses 2 through 10, when Mary Magdalene runs to report that the tomb is empty, Peter and the beloved disciple both run to investigate. The beloved disciple arrives first, but waits outside. Peter arrives second and goes straight in. The beloved disciple then enters, sees, and believes. And then, as we discussed in chapter 6, they both go back to their homes. They leave. Mary, who arrived with them, or shortly after, stays. In the scene that follows, she receives the resurrection appearance that they did not receive. There is something in the structure of this narrative. The men running, looking, leaving, while the woman stays and receives, that the scholar Anne Graham Brock, in her book, Mary Magdalene, the First Apostle, reads as a deliberate narrative choice by John. The beloved disciple believes at the tomb, but he believes without seeing the risen Jesus. Mary sees and speaks with the risen Jesus, and she is sent. John's Gospel seems to be doing something careful here with the relative positions of these figures. Now in Luke chapter 24, after the women report the resurrection and are not believed, verse 12 records, in most manuscripts, that Peter ran to the tomb, stooped down, saw the burial cloths lying by themselves, and went home, amazed. He is alone in this account, and he sees the cloths, but not the risen Jesus. Later in the same chapter, verse 34, there is a brief reference to the risen Jesus having appeared to Simon. This appearance to Peter is mentioned but not described in Luke. It receives a passing reference rather than a scene. Compare this to the extensive, intimate, scene-by-scene account of Mary Magdalene's encounter in John chapter 20, and you begin to sense why some scholars read these texts as reflecting different communities with different views about which witness was most central. Both Peter and Mary are honored, but the nature and detail of how they are honored differs significantly depending on which gospel you are reading. When we move into the non-canonical texts, the tension becomes explicit rather than structural. In the Gospel of Mary, as we explored last chapter, Peter challenges Mary's authority directly, asking whether Jesus really spoke privately with a woman and not openly with the male disciples. This is not a subtle suggestion. It is an open objection. And Levi's response, if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Does not soften it. The scholar Anne Graham Brock has argued carefully that this scene in the Gospel of Mary reflects real tensions in the 2nd century church about the basis of apostolic authority. Was authority grounded in being one of the 12, in institutional continuity, in gender? Or was it grounded in spiritual receptivity, in having received revelation from Jesus, in fidelity through suffering? Mary Magdalene embodied one answer to that question. Peter, as he appears in these texts, embodied a different one. And the argument between them, whether we read it as historical memory or as theological symbol, clearly resonated with enough communities to be written down and preserved in multiple forms. Then there is the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, and specifically its final logion, saying number 114. I want to be very clear about this text before I describe it, because it contains something genuinely troubling. Logion 114 records Peter saying, "Let Mary leave us, for females are not worthy of life." This is a harsh statement, and the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas responds not by simply affirming Mary, but by saying that he will lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. This is deeply strange language to modern ears, and it reflects a Gnostic theological framework in which maleness functioned as a spiritual category distinct from biological sex, a framework we do not need to enter into in detail here. What matters for our purposes is that this text, whatever its theological framework, reflects a tradition in which Mary Magdalene's inclusion in the community of the spiritually enlightened was contested on the basis of her being a woman, and in which Jesus was portrayed as overriding that contest. The Gospel of Thomas sits at the most extreme end of the textual tradition on this question, and the scholars I mentioned, Brock and Esther de Boer, in her work, Mary Magdalene, beyond the myth, are careful to note it as exactly that, an extreme expression of a broader tension. What the Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, in her landmark work, In Memory of Her, published in 1983, has contributed to our understanding is a framework for thinking about what she calls the discipleship of equals in the early Jesus movement. The idea that the movement around Jesus, in its earliest form, included women as full participants, and that the gradual restriction of women's roles in the developing church was not inevitable or scripturally mandated, but was rather a historical process, driven by social pressures and the adoption of Greco-Roman household structures. Within this framework, the Peter-Mary tension in the ancient texts is not just a literary motif. It is a trace of real institutional history, the record of a time when different visions of the church were competing with each other, and when the figure of Mary Magdalene represented one of those visions. I find this interpretive framework genuinely compelling in its broad strokes, though I want to be honest that it is an interpretation. Schussler Fiorenza is doing feminist theology as much as she is doing historical reconstruction, and those are related but distinct activities. Here is something I want to be careful about, though, and I think intellectual honesty requires me to say it clearly. The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do not present an explicit conflict between Peter and Mary Magdalene. Peter does not question her authority in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. He runs to the tomb and marvels. He receives his own resurrection appearance. He will go on to lead the early Jerusalem community and be a central figure in the Acts of the Apostles. The tension we are discussing in this chapter becomes explicit only in the non-canonical texts, which were composed a century or more after the events they describe, and within specific theological communities with specific axes to grind. Reading the Peter-Mary conflict as straightforward biography, as if we are watching a personal rivalry between two first-century people, would be going further than the evidence allows. What we can say is that the contrast between their roles in different ancient texts is real, that it was significant enough to be written about repeatedly, and that it reflects something genuine about the diversity of early Christianity. What I find most honest and most helpful is to hold both truths simultaneously. Mary Magdalene is the first resurrection witness in the canonical Gospels. That is not disputed. Peter is the leader of the Jerusalem community in Acts, and the recipient of a special resurrection appearance in Luke and 1 Corinthians. That is also not disputed. Both of these things are true in the ancient record. The early church was large enough and diverse enough to honor both of them, even if individual communities sometimes place different emphasis on each. The texts that pit them against each other directly, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, are telling us something about debates within specific communities in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They are valuable historical evidence, but they are evidence about those communities and their debates, not necessarily evidence about what Mary and Peter themselves said or felt about each other in the 1st century. I find something genuinely moving in the idea that the memory of Mary Magdalene was preserved and championed across multiple centuries and multiple communities by people who read the same gospel texts we have and who came away convinced that her role had been undervalued. From the 3rd century community that produced the Gospel of Mary, to Hippolytus of Rome calling her apostle to the apostles, due to the Eastern Orthodox tradition maintaining her title of equal to the apostles from its earliest centuries, there is a thread of recognition running through all of these that I think the texts themselves support. She was there. She was first. She was sent. And the people who cared about those facts made sure they were not entirely forgotten, even when institutional pressure might have made it easier to let them go. As this chapter closes, I want to leave you resting in the thought that the story of Mary Magdalene has always been a story about more than one person. It has been a story about what the early followers of Jesus believed about spiritual authority, about whose testimony counts, about who gets to speak and who gets to lead. Those questions did not begin in the modern era. They were alive in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and they were argued over in texts that have now been recovered and read by millions. In the chapter ahead, we are going to move away from the ancient world entirely and into the medieval one, to the remarkable and sometimes bizarre world of legend, relics, and pilgrimage that grew up around Mary Magdalene's name in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. It is a world that invented freely and embellished generously, and it tells us as much about medieval Christianity's needs and anxieties as it does about the 1st century woman at the center of the story. Rest now, and let the night hold you gently. Let me take you on a different kind of journey tonight, not into the 1st century, not into archaeological digs or ancient manuscripts, but into the medieval world, into the age of cathedrals and pilgrimage roads and the great flowering of Christian legend that grew up across Western Europe between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries. This is a world where the line between history and story was drawn very differently than we draw it today, where a compelling narrative about a saint carried its own kind of truth, where holy relics drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims across dangerous roads, and where the needs of living communities shaped the stories they told about the dead. And in this world, Mary Magdalene became something quite extraordinary. She became one of the most popular saints in the entire medieval Catholic tradition, the subject of pilgrimage routes, the patron of dozens of abbeys and churches, the figure whose supposed bones were fought over by competing cities for centuries. And none of it had any support in the ancient texts we have been exploring together. But all of it tells us something real about the people who believed it and why they needed to. The foundational text for understanding the medieval Mary Magdalene legend is a collection called the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend, compiled by an Italian Dominican friar named Jacobus de Voragine around the year 1260. This text was, in its day, one of the most widely read books in the Christian world, second only to the Bible itself in terms of circulation. It collected the legends of hundreds of saints in vivid narrative form, and its entry on Mary Magdalene is one of its longest and most dramatic. According to the Legenda Aurea, after the resurrection of Jesus, Mary Magdalene and a group of companions, including Lazarus, Martha, and several others, were placed by their enemies in a boat with no oars, no sails, and no food, and pushed out to sea from the coast of Palestine. The clear expectation was that they would perish, but instead, by divine providence, the boat carried them safely across the Mediterranean and landed on the shores of what is now southern France, near the city of Marseille. There, the legend tells us, Mary Magdalene began to preach the gospel to the people of Provence, converting the local ruler and his wife, and establishing Christianity in the region. The story continues from there in ways that become increasingly elaborate. After years of missionary activity in southern France, Mary is said to have retired to a cave in a rocky limestone massif in Provence, a place that still exists today and is called La Sainte Baume, meaning the holy balm or the holy cave. There, according to the legend, she spent 30 years as a hermit, eating nothing, sustained by angels who carried her heavenward 7 times each day so that she could hear the music of paradise. She is said to have been carried in this way, lifted into the air by angels, until her death, at which point a bishop named Maximinus, one of the 72 disciples of Jesus, administered her last communion and buried her. Her relics, the legend maintains, were preserved and eventually discovered centuries later. The story is beautiful and strange in equal measure, the kind of narrative that speaks powerfully to the medieval imagination, with its love of dramatic spiritual transformation and supernatural intervention. But that bears no relationship to anything recorded in any ancient Christian source from before the 9th century. The historian Catherine Ludwig Jansen, in her meticulous scholarly work, The Making of the Magdalene, published in 2000, traces exactly when and how this legend developed, and what she finds is revealing. The first appearance of a tradition connecting Mary Magdalene to southern France dates to the 9th century at the earliest, nearly 9 full centuries after her lifetime. Before that, there is simply nothing. No ancient church father, not Origen, not Eusebius, not Jerome, not Augustine, mentions any journey of Mary Magdalene to France. No early martyrs list or saints calendar places her in Provence. The tradition appears, seemingly from nowhere, in the early medieval period, and Jansen connects its emergence to specific institutional interests. Abbeys and churches in Provence needed to establish spiritual credentials, to attract pilgrims, and to claim apostolic connections that would give them prestige and authority. A tradition connecting their region directly to a figure from the gospel narrative served all of those purposes. The legend was not born from malice or deliberate deception in most cases. It grew from the genuine desire of communities to feel connected to the sacred story. What happened next in the history of the legend is almost comically competitive, and I say that with genuine affection for the human need that drives it. By the 9th century, an abbey at Vézelay in Burgundy, in the north of France, a very long way from Provence, was claiming to possess the relics of Mary Magdalene. This claim drew enormous numbers of pilgrims, and Vézelay became one of the major pilgrimage centers of medieval Europe, a gathering point on the road to Santiago de Compostela. Then, in 1279, a Dominican-run site in Provence called Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume announced that it had discovered what it claimed were the authentic relics of Mary Magdalene. And its claim was endorsed by the French royal family, specifically by Charles II of Anjou, who had considerable political reasons to support a major pilgrimage centre in his own territory. The rivalry between Vézelay and Saint-Maximin became a genuine medieval controversy, with each side producing documents and theological arguments for why its relics were the real ones. The fact that no ancient source placed Mary Magdalene's body in France at all was apparently not considered a decisive objection to either claim. The French scholar Victor Saxe spent decades studying the cult of Mary Magdalene in the medieval West, and his detailed work, Le culte de Mary Magdalene en Occident, published in 1959, remains one of the most comprehensive historical treatments of how her legend developed and spread. What Saxe's work shows is that the cult of Mary Magdalene in France and across Western Europe was not a marginal phenomenon. It was central to medieval Catholic devotional life. Major churches were dedicated to her from England to Germany to Italy. Her image appeared in illuminated manuscripts, cathedral carvings, and stained glass windows across the continent. The penitent Mary Magdalene, weeping, anointing, and hair flowing, holding the alabaster jar, became one of the most recognizable figures in all of Western religious art. She was invoked as a patron by perfumers, hairdressers, and converted prostitutes. She was prayed to by people who identified with the experience of falling and being lifted back up. And underlying all of it was Gregory's composite figure, not the historical Mary from Magdala, but the merged and legendary creation of the 6th century papal homily. Here is what I find genuinely poignant about all of this, when I sit with it honestly. The people who built the abbeys and walked the pilgrimage roads and prayed to the Mary Magdalene of legend were not doing something meaningless. They were doing something deeply human, reaching back toward a story that spoke to their own experience of being lost and found, of suffering and redemption, of being seen and known by God in their most broken moments. The composite Mary Magdalene that Gregory created and the medieval church elaborated, the woman who had fallen to the lowest place and risen to become the first witness of the resurrection, was a genuinely compelling spiritual figure. She addressed something real in people's hearts. The problem was not with their need or their devotion. The problem was that the woman they were reaching toward was largely a construction, and the real woman behind the name, healed, faithful, first at the tomb, apostle to the apostles, had been quietly displaced by the legend laid over her. I think about the cave at La Sainte-Baume, which still exists in Provence today and is still a pilgrimage site. Thousands of people visit it every year, walking up the same rocky path, through the same dense forest, going to pray in the same stone grotto, where the legend says Mary Magdalene lived for 30 years. There is no historical evidence that she ever set foot in southern France. But there is something about the place, the cool dark of the cave, the silence of the forest, the sense of withdrawal from the ordinary world, that has drawn human beings in search of the sacred for over 1,000 years. The medieval pilgrims who came there were not wrong to need what they were seeking. They were just, perhaps, seeking it in a place that had been pointed to by legend rather than by history. I find I can hold both of those truths at once. The legend was not reliable, and the need that drove people to believe it was entirely real. What strikes me, as we step back and look at the full sweep of the medieval Mary Magdalene tradition, is how completely it reversed the actual emphasis of the biblical text. In the canonical Gospels, what is most distinctive about Mary Magdalene is her presence, her steadiness, her fidelity, her role as first witness. In the medieval legend, what is most distinctive is her past, her supposed sinfulness, her penitence, her dramatic conversion. The biblical texts say almost nothing about her before her healing. The medieval tradition built an entire elaborate edifice on that before, and the after, the resurrection morning, the apostolic commission, the faithful testimony, gets relatively little attention in the legend compared to the penitent years in the cave. It is as if the medieval tradition took the part of her story that the Bible says least about and made it the center, while the part the Bible treats as most significant, her witness at the resurrection, became a supporting detail. The inversion is almost complete. As we close this chapter and move toward rest, I want to leave you with a thought about the relationship between need and truth in the stories we tell. The medieval world needed a Mary Magdalene who had been a sinner and been forgiven, because ordinary people who felt burdened by their own failings needed to believe that radical transformation was possible. That need was real and it was valid. But the story that served that need was not the story that the ancient texts actually tell. In the chapters ahead, we are going to see how this tension between need and accuracy played out in the world of art, how painters and sculptors across the centuries gave visual form to the legendary Mary Magdalene and fixed her image in the cultural imagination in ways that were beautiful and profound and almost entirely disconnected from the woman who appears in the first century texts. Rest gently now and let the medieval world settle into the quiet of the night around you. There is something I want you to picture tonight. A particular image that I think most of us carry somewhere in our minds when we hear the name Mary Magdalene. A woman with long, flowing hair, often red, often unbound and loose around her shoulders. She is holding or standing near an alabaster jar. Her expression is one of intense devotion or deep penitence. Eyes cast upward, tears sometimes visible, face luminous with feeling. Her clothing is rich, but somewhat disheveled, suggesting a person in the grip of powerful emotion. This is the Mary Magdalene that Western art gave the world. An image so repeatedly painted and carved and illuminated across 12 centuries of European art that it feels, to most of us, almost like the only possible visual version of her. And yet the biblical text, as we have established together across these chapters, contains not a single physical description of Mary Magdalene, not one word about her appearance, no mention of her hair color, no description of her face. Everything in that iconic image was invented by artists, reflecting not the woman in the ancient texts, but the accumulated interpretations, legends, and theological needs of the centuries that followed. And tonight, I want to explore where each of those visual elements came from, because the art history of Mary Magdalene is, in its own way, a kind of theology, a record of what each era believed about her, painted onto wood and canvas and stone. Let us start with the alabaster jar, because this is her most consistent iconographic attribute. the object you will find in her hands in almost every depiction across almost every century of Western religious art. Its origin in the visual tradition is not from Mary Magdalene's story in the canonical Gospels. It comes from two other passages that Gregory's 6th century conflation attached to her. The first is the account in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50, where the unnamed sinful woman brings an alabaster jar of ointment and anoints Jesus' feet in the house of the Pharisee. The second is the account of Mary of Bethany in John chapter 12, verse 3, where she takes a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard and anoints Jesus' feet, wiping them with her hair. Neither of these women is Mary Magdalene in the biblical text. But once Gregory merged all three women into one composite figure, the alabaster jar, the ointment, the anointing, became Mary Magdalene's defining object. And artists, working from liturgical traditions and sermon literature rather than from direct biblical text, repeated that object in painting after painting for over 1,000 years. The jar tells us about Gregory's sermon, not about the woman from Magdala. And then there is the red hair. This is one of those details that feels so embedded in the popular image that it seems almost natural. Of course, Mary Magdalene had red hair, except that the text says nothing about her hair at all. The association of red hair with Mary Magdalene in medieval and Renaissance European art is a product of specific cultural conventions that had nothing to do with historical information. In the visual codes of medieval Northern European art, red hair was a color associated with social danger, with sensuality, with figures who existed outside the norms of respectable society. Judas Iscariot is frequently depicted with red hair in medieval art for similar reasons. The attribution of red hair to Mary Magdalene was therefore a visual shorthand for the composite legendary figure, the woman who had been a sinner, who had lived outside respectability, whose dangerous past was written on her body. The art historian Susan Haskins, in her comprehensive study, Mary Magdalene, Myth and Metaphor, published in 1993, traces this iconographic tradition in careful detail, showing how artistic convention built on itself across generations until a purely invented visual characteristic became as fixed in people's minds as if it had been recorded in scripture. One of the most powerful visual depictions of Mary Magdalene in the entire Western art tradition is one that breaks dramatically from the sensual or passionate model. And I find it worth spending time with, because it shows how extraordinarily diverse the artistic tradition actually is. Donatello, the great Florentine sculptor, created a wooden sculpture of Mary Magdalene around 1453 to 1455 that now stands in the baptistry of Florence. It is nothing like the luminous, beautiful, she emotionally expressive figure of most Renaissance painting. Donatello's Mary Magdalene is gaunt, almost emaciated, her long hair hanging loose and matted, her body wrapped in what appears to be garments made of her own hair. Her face is deeply lined, her cheeks hollow, her posture that of someone near the end of a long physical ordeal. It is, unmistakably, the figure of the penitent hermit from the Legenda Aurea, the woman who had spent 30 years in a cave in Provence, sustained by angels and stripped of everything earthly. It is a theologically specific image, making a specific claim about who Mary Magdalene was and what her story meant. And it is one of the most arresting works of art in the entire 15th century. Not because it is accurate, but because it is so committed, so fully realized. She's so entirely given over to its chosen interpretation. The painters of the 16th and 17th centuries, and there were many of them all across Europe, approached Mary Magdalene with different theological interests shaped by the debates of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Titian painted her several times, including a famous penitent Mary Magdalene, in which she holds the jar of ointment and gazes heavenward, her long hair strategically arranged around her body in a composition that manages simultaneously to suggest both sensuality and repentance. El Greco painted her in his characteristically elongated, spiritually intense style, and Caravaggio, that extraordinarily turbulent genius of the early 17th century, painted a Mary Magdalene that feels startlingly human and contemporary. She, a young woman, sitting alone, with her head bowed, absorbed in private grief or prayer, a jar of perfume beside her on the floor. In all of these works, the Counter-Reformation interest in the sacrament of penance is visible. Mary Magdalene was being used, quite deliberately, to argue for the importance and the efficacy of repentance and confession, subjects at the center of the theological battles between Catholic and Protestant Christianity in that era. The art was serving a theological agenda, and the image of Mary Magdalene was the vehicle. Diane Apostolos Cappadona, a scholar who has studied the iconography of Mary Magdalene in detail in her work, In Search of Mary Magdalene, helps us understand just how pervasive and powerful this artistic tradition became in shaping popular perception. By the time of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the visual image of Mary Magdalene was so widely reproduced, so familiar, so emotionally resonant, that it functioned almost as a parallel scripture for the largely illiterate population of medieval and early modern Europe. The people who could not read Luke chapter 8 or John chapter 20 could see Mary Magdalene on the walls of their local church, weeping, anointing, repenting, ascending in prayer. And they derived from that image a whole theology of sin and forgiveness that was, as we have seen, largely built on Gregory's conflation rather than on the biblical text. Art was doing the work of theology, and it was doing it through a figure who had already been significantly transformed from her original textual form. What strikes me about this entire artistic tradition, when I look at it honestly, is the gap between the woman who actually appears in the biblical text and the woman who appears in the paintings. The biblical Mary Magdalene is active. She moves, she travels, she stays, she speaks, she carries messages. The painted Mary Magdalene is mostly passive. She weeps, she gazes, she repents. She is caught in an eternal posture of emotional expression. The biblical Mary Magdalene is defined by what she does. She follows, she funds, she witnesses, she testifies. The painted Mary Magdalene is defined by what she was: a sinner, a penitent, a woman whose past explains her tears. The shift from active subject to passive emblem is significant, and I think it reflects something real about how the visual tradition processed Gregory's conflation. Once you define her primarily by her supposed sinful past, the things she does in the present become secondary to what she is, and what she is becomes a theological symbol rather than a historical person. I find the art genuinely beautiful. I want to be clear about that. There is something in Caravaggio's bowed-headed Mary, in Donatello's gaunt and wind-worn penitent, in Titian's luminous, skyward-gazing figure, that speaks to real human experience and real spiritual longing. These artists were not cynically manufacturing images. They were giving visual form to something that they and their audiences genuinely felt: the need for a figure who embodied both the depths of human failure and the heights of divine mercy. The composite Mary Magdalene served that need powerfully. But there is a cost to that service, and the cost is the erasure of the real woman. When the art is so pervasive, so emotionally compelling, so deeply embedded in the culture's visual imagination, it becomes very hard to see past it to the quieter, stranger, more historically grounded figure in the ancient texts. The woman from Magdala, healed and faithful, standing in the dark outside a tomb, hearing her name spoken in the grey light of a Sunday morning. As we draw this chapter to its close, I want to acknowledge something that I think is true about how images shape belief. When we encounter a figure as many times as most Western Christians have encountered the iconic image of Mary Magdalene, in church windows, in museum paintings, in illustrated Bibles, in films and television, the image becomes the reality for most of us, more real than any scholarly description could be. That is the power of art, and it is a genuine power. But it is also a responsibility. When the image is built on misreading, when centuries of visual tradition encode a mistake and then reproduce that mistake in the most emotionally compelling medium available, correcting the record becomes extraordinarily difficult. The art of Mary Magdalene is one of the most instructive examples I know of how powerfully visual culture can shape what we believe we know. In the chapter ahead, we are going to explore how the institutional church itself, after living with that visual tradition for more than a millennium, began to work its way back toward a more accurate understanding of who this woman actually was. There is something quietly remarkable about watching a large institution change its mind. It does not happen quickly. It does not happen dramatically most of the time. It happens through the slow accumulation of careful scholarship, through the persistent pressure of honest reading, through the gradual recognition that something said with great authority a very long time ago was simply wrong, and that the wrongness has consequences for real people and real understanding. Tonight, I want to walk you through one of the most significant examples of that kind of institutional reckoning in the modern history of the Christian Church. The long, slow, still incomplete process by which the Roman Catholic Church and other Christian traditions alongside it have worked their way back toward a more accurate understanding of who Mary Magdalene actually was. It took, as we have established, roughly 14 centuries from Gregory's homily to the first formal liturgical correction. And even that correction, when it came in 1969, came quietly, embedded in revisions to the Roman Missal, rather than announced with anything like the prominence Gregory's original claim had carried. The story of how institutions change is rarely a clean or satisfying one, but I think it is worth knowing, because it tells us something real about how truth eventually finds its way through, even when the path is very long. Let me begin with the 1969 Reform, because this is the moment when the Roman Catholic Church, officially in its liturgical practice, separated the three women that Gregory had fused together in his 6th century homily. The reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which concluded in 1965, prompted a comprehensive revision of the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar, the official list of saints' feasts and the prayers associated with them. Yet in the course of that revision, the scholarship that had for decades been pointing out the problems with Gregory's conflation was finally reflected in official practice. Mary Magdalene's feast on July 22nd was now treated as honoring specifically Mary Magdalene, the woman from Magdala, the disciple who followed Jesus, the first resurrection witness, and not a composite figure who also included Mary of Bethany and the unnamed penitent of Luke chapter 7. It was a real change, and it mattered. But the scholar Robert Fastiggi, writing in the New Catholic Encyclopedia, notes it in relatively technical terms as a liturgical revision, not a dramatic public declaration. The Church corrected its calendar. The popular image of Mary Magdalene as the penitent prostitute, embedded in 14 centuries of art and sermon and story, was not so easily revised. Changing the missal does not immediately change what millions of people picture when they hear a name. The Eastern Orthodox tradition stands in an interesting relationship to all of this, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it illuminates something important about what a different starting point produces. The Orthodox Church never accepted Gregory's conflation in the first place. From its earliest centuries, Eastern Christianity maintained that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed woman of Luke 7 were three distinct individuals, a position that aligns entirely with a careful reading of the canonical texts. And because the Orthodox tradition never saddled Mary Magdalene with the weight of Gregory's composite, it was free to honor her on straightforwardly apostolic terms. The Orthodox Church celebrates her feast on July the 22nd as a feast of an equal to the apostles, is apostolos in Greek. This is among the highest honors the Orthodox tradition bestows. It has been given to Constantine's mother, Helena, to Nino, who brought Christianity to Georgia, to Vladimir, who brought it to Russia. It was given to Mary Magdalene because she met the criteria plainly and without complication. She witnessed the risen Christ, and she was sent to proclaim that witness. The Eastern Church read John chapter 20 and called what it saw by its proper name, and it has been doing so consistently for 2,000 years. The Protestant reformers of the 16th century present a different and somewhat more complicated picture. Martin Luther and John Calvin both lived and worked within the Western Christian tradition that had inherited Gregory's conflation, and neither of them undertook a systematic re-examination of the three women question. Luther, who was himself a former monk deeply shaped by the penitential theology of the medieval church, continued to refer to Mary Magdalene in ways that echoed the composite tradition, emphasizing her as a model of grace and forgiveness for those who had fallen deeply. Calvin, characteristically more systematic in his biblical interpretation, acknowledged the sinful woman of Luke 7 as a distinct figure from Mary Magdalene with somewhat more care, though the popular Protestant tradition in his wake did not consistently maintain that distinction. What the Reformation broadly did for Mary Magdalene was shift the theological emphasis placed on her. Where medieval Catholicism had stressed her penitence and her intercessory role as a saint, Protestant traditions emphasized her as a direct model of grace received through faith, a slightly different theological frame around largely the same inherited composite figure. The underlying misidentification persisted on both sides of the Reformation divide. No formal ecumenical council, not Nicaea, not Chalcedon, not Trent, not Vatican II, ever issued a definitive doctrinal statement about the identity of Mary Magdalene. This is worth noting clearly because it means that even Gregory's influential conflation was never elevated to the level of dogma in the technical sense. It was a homiletic tradition, a devotional convention, a liturgical habit, powerful and pervasive, but never formally defined as something Catholics were required to believe. This created, over the centuries, a space in which scholars could question the conflation without technically challenging official doctrine, which is part of why the biblical scholarship pointing out the problems with Gregory's identification was able to develop and accumulate across the 20th century without triggering formal condemnation. The space between a widespread devotional tradition and a defined doctrinal position is a real space, and it was in that space that the scholarly reassessment of Mary Magdalene slowly gathered momentum. Then came 2016, and something happened that felt, to many observers, like a genuinely significant moment. Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day in the Catholic liturgical calendar from the rank of memorial to the rank of feast, the same rank given to feasts of the apostles themselves. This was not a casual administrative change. The Congregation for Divine Worship issued a formal decree explaining the decision, and Archbishop Reno Fisichella wrote an accompanying essay that engaged directly with the theological significance of Mary Magdalene's role in the resurrection narrative. Fisichella reflected on her as a witness and proclaimer, on the apostolic character of what she did on Easter morning, and connected the elevation of her feast day to the Church's renewed appreciation of her New Testament role. I want to be honest that I encourage you to read that decree directly if you want to know its precise wording, since I am drawing on secondary accounts rather than the primary document. But the significance of the change is widely attested. For the first time in the Latin Church's history, Mary Magdalene's feast was formally granted the same liturgical weight as those of the apostles she had been sent to tell. What I find moving about this whole arc, from Gregory's homily in 591 to the 2016 decree, is the way it illustrates both the fragility and the resilience of historical truth. The fragility is evident. A single authoritative voice in the 6th century managed to displace a careful reading of the text for well over a millennium in the Western Church. The resilience is equally evident. The texts themselves remained. Scholars kept reading them. The Eastern tradition kept its different account alive. And eventually, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, the institutional West moved back toward what the texts had always said. Mary Magdalene did not need to be rescued by modern scholarship from the New Testament. She was there in the New Testament all along, exactly as the apostolic witness the Eastern Church had always recognized. What needed rescuing was not her story, but our reading of it. There is something else worth noting about the modern period, and it concerns the way broader cultural changes have intersected with this ecclesiastical reassessment. The 20th century brought with it significant shifts in how women's roles in religious communities were discussed and debated, and those shifts inevitably affected how figures like Mary Magdalene were read and valued. The rise of feminist biblical scholarship, represented by figures like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, whose work in memory of her we have mentioned previously, and by Sandra Schneiders and Amy Jill Levine, created a body of careful, text-based scholarship that argued for the historical significance of women in the early Jesus movement and traced how that significance had been systematically minimized in later centuries. This scholarship did not invent a new Mary Magdalene. It returned again and again to the same verses in Luke and John and Matthew and Mark, and it asked, what does the text actually say? And it found, as we have found together in these chapters, that the text says something quite specific and quite significant, that this woman was present, faithful, first, and commissioned. That is not a feminist projection onto the text. It is what the text plainly says. The relationship between institutional change and scholarly pressure is never entirely clean. And I want to acknowledge that the Church's evolving position on Mary Magdalene has not resolved all of the debates we have been exploring. The question of women's leadership in the Church, in both Catholic and many Protestant traditions, remains a live and contested one, and Mary Magdalene's story is inevitably drawn into those debates. Some theologians read her apostolic role as having direct implications for questions of ordained ministry. Others argue that apostleship, as she exercised it, does not map directly onto later institutional structures. These are genuine theological disputes, and they are not resolved by the liturgical changes of 1969 or 2016, however significant those changes were. I offer no resolution to them tonight. What I do think is clear, from everything we have explored together, is that the starting point for any honest engagement with these questions must be the texts themselves. And those texts show us a woman who was given a commission, who carried it faithfully, and whose role was recognized as apostolic by some of the earliest Christian interpreters we have record of. As we move toward rest tonight, I want to leave you holding the long view, the full sweep of what we have traced across this chapter. An institution that made a significant error in 591 spent 14 centuries slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely working toward correcting it. The Eastern tradition, which never made the error, maintained a cleaner and more scripturally grounded reading throughout. Modern scholarship provided the rigorous textual analysis that made the formal correction intellectually coherent and defensible. And in 2016, the Western Church formally acknowledged, in its liturgical practice, what the Eastern Church had always known, and what the texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had always recorded. That the woman from Magdala who stood in the garden on Easter morning was an apostle, in the fullest sense the word can carry. It is a long story about truth and institution and time. And in the chapter ahead, we are going to come back to the ground itself, to the stones and coins and ancient walls of Magdala, and let the archaeology show us one more time the world that this woman actually came from and walked through. I want to take you somewhere very specific tonight, not into ancient manuscripts or medieval legend or institutional history, but into the actual ground, into soil and stone and ancient mortar, into the physical place where a real woman lived a real life in a real century. Because for all the centuries of interpretation and legend and artistic invention that have accumulated over Mary Magdalene's name, there is something genuinely anchoring about what archaeologists have been pulling out of the earth at Magdala since 2009. Something that cuts through the elaboration and the misreading and the composite figures and says quietly, here is where she lived. Here is what her world looked like. Here is the stone her feet walked on, the water she looked out at every morning, the community of Jewish practice she was formed by. And archaeology cannot tell us about Mary Magdalene personally. No inscription bears her name. No artifact belongs specifically to her. But it can show us the world she inhabited with remarkable precision. And I find that physical grounding one of the most valuable things we can bring to her story. Tonight, let me walk you through what the shovels and brushes at Magdala have found, and what it means for how we understand the woman at the center of our story. The excavations at Magdala, the ancient site on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, about 5 kilometers north of the modern city of Tiberias, began in earnest in 2009. Two archaeologists, Dina Avshalom Gorni and Arfan Najjar of the Israel Antiquities Authority, were conducting a salvage excavation ahead of construction work on the site, when they made a discovery that immediately captured the attention of scholars around the world. Beneath the surface of the ground, in excellent preservation, given its age, lay a first-century synagogue. Not a later building, not a structure from the Byzantine period or the medieval era, but a synagogue that the archaeological evidence, the pottery, the coins, the stratigraphic layers, dates firmly to the 1st century CE, to the exact period when Mary Magdalene would have lived, and when Jesus is recorded in the Gospels as moving through the synagogues of Galilee. It is one of only 7 synagogues from the Second Temple period that have been identified and excavated in all of Israel, and it sits in the town that bears her name. The synagogue itself, when you read the excavation reports, is a remarkable structure. It was a small, rectangular building with stone benches running along the interior walls. the kind of seating arrangement where a congregation would gather to hear the Torah read and interpreted. The floor was decorated with mosaic work. There were frescoes on the walls. At the center of the building, the excavators found something extraordinary that I want to describe carefully. A carved stone block, roughly the size and shape of a low table or podium, decorated on all four of its sides and on its top with intricate carvings. On one face of this stone, carved in careful relief, is a 7-branched menorah, the sacred lampstand that stood in the Jerusalem temple. The Magdala stone, as it has come to be known, is now recognized as bearing the oldest carved depiction of the temple menorah ever found anywhere outside Jerusalem itself. Think about what that means. The community at Magdala was carving an image of the temple's most sacred object into the stone at the center of their synagogue, expressing, in physical form, their connection to the temple in Jerusalem, their identity as part of the wider Jewish people, their participation in the faith that Mary Magdalene herself would have shared. Stefano De Luca, an Italian archaeologist who has conducted extensive survey work at Magdala and in the broader region, published detailed reports between 2009 and 2015 on what the accumulated evidence tells us about the site. What emerges from his work is a picture of a prosperous, active, connected community. The harbour installations at Magdala, the remains of stone quays and boat landing structures along the ancient shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, confirm exactly what Josephus described in his Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 21, Verse 8. A significant town with a working waterfront. The fish processing installations, where fish caught in the lake would be cleaned, salted, and packed for distribution, reveal an industry of real scale. Coins found at the site, minted in the 1st century CE, speak to commercial activity and integration with the broader economic world of Roman-era Palestine. The residential quarter, with its stone houses and domestic spaces, gives us a physical sense of what daily life in Magdala looked like for the people who lived there. This was not a village. It was a town with real infrastructure and real prosperity. The mikveh, the ritual purification bath, found at the Magdala site, tells us something I find particularly important about the community's religious character. A mikveh is not a luxury feature. It requires careful construction to meet the requirements of Jewish law. The water must be gathered in a specific way. The dimensions must meet certain specifications. The access must be appropriate for ritual use. Communities built mikvaot because they were committed to the practices of Torah observance, to the rhythms of purity and purification that structured Jewish life in the Second Temple period. The presence of a mikveh at Magdala tells us that the community there was practicing, observant, and shaped by the same religious framework that formed every observant Jewish person in 1st century Palestine, including Mary Magdalene herself. When she encountered Jesus, who himself moved through synagogues, who debated Torah interpretation, who drew on the language of the Hebrew prophets, she was encountering someone who spoke the same religious language she had grown up in. The mikveh at Magdala is a small stone reminder of the deeply Jewish world from which she came. The destruction of Magdala is itself part of the historical record, and it adds a poignant dimension to the archaeology. According to the historical sources, including Josephus's account in the Jewish War, the city of Magdala, which Josephus called Taricheae, was the site of a significant battle in 67 CE during the First Jewish Revolt against Rome. The Romans, under Vespasian, attacked the city, and it was captured and largely destroyed. The inhabitants were killed or enslaved. The thriving fishing town on the western shore of the Galilee was gone within a generation of Mary Magdalene's time there. The stratigraphic evidence at the site is consistent with this. The first century occupation layer ends in destruction and abandonment. This means that the world Mary Magdalene grew up in, the synagogue she may have attended, the harbour she looked out at, the streets she walked, all of it was gone within living memory of her own time. The physical world she came from was swept away by the same Roman military machine that had crucified Jesus. The archaeology of Magdala is, among other things, the archaeology of an ending. I want to be honest with you about something important, and it is the kind of honesty I think the archaeology itself demands. No inscription found at Magdala mentions Mary Magdalene by name. No artifact has been identified as belonging to her specifically. The connection between this particular woman and this particular site is geographical and inferential. We know she was called the Magdalene. We know there was a town called Magdala. And we know that the convention of naming a person after their hometown was standard practice in first century Jewish culture. So when we say that the Magdala synagogue is the synagogue Mary Magdalene likely prayed in, or that the harbour structures are those she looked out at growing up, we are making a reasonable and well-supported inference, but it is still an inference. The scholar Joan Taylor, in her careful historical work on first-century Galilee, is consistently careful about this kind of distinction, and I want to honour that carefulness here. The archaeology gives us the world. It gives us the context, the physical environment, the community structures, the religious practices. It cannot give us the person herself. What the Magdala stone in particular has done for the scholarly and popular understanding of Mary Magdalene's world is significant. The image of the temple menorah carved at the center of a Galilean synagogue suggests that the community at Magdala understood itself as deeply connected to the Jerusalem temple, to the central institution of Jewish religious life, even though Magdala was a 3-day journey from Jerusalem on foot. This is consistent with what we know from other sources about Galilean Jewish identity in the first century. Galileans were not isolated from the broader currents of Jewish life. They participated in temple pilgrimage. They paid the temple tax. They were shaped by the same scriptural tradition and the same calendar of festivals as Jews throughout the land of Israel and the diaspora. When Mary Magdalene is described in Luke chapter 8 as a woman who had followed Jesus and supported his ministry, she is a person formed by exactly this world. The world of the Magdala synagogue, of the menorah stone, of the mikveh and the harbour and the fish market. The Galilean Judaism visible in the Magdala excavations is the Judaism that formed her. The site of Magdala today is managed and developed by a Catholic organization. And I want to note that for you, clearly, because it is relevant to how the site presents itself, the archaeological work is genuine and the findings are real. The synagogue, the Magdala stone, the harbour, the mikveh are all authentic first century remains properly excavated and documented by professional archaeologists working under the oversight of the Israel Antiquities Authority. But the site also includes a modern pilgrimage church, devotional spaces, and presentations that blend the archaeological findings with the devotional tradition of Mary Magdalene in ways that do not always carefully distinguish between what the ground has revealed and what the tradition has added. This is not unusual for sacred sites in the Holy Land. The mixture of archaeology and devotion is something visitors and readers encounter constantly in that region. I simply want you to know it, so that when you read about Magdala, you can appreciate the genuine archaeological findings on their own terms, separate from the devotional framing that accompanies them on site. As we bring this chapter to its close, I want to leave you with the image that I find most moving from everything the Magdala excavations have given us. In the center of a first-century synagogue, in a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, someone carved a 7-branched menorah into a block of stone. They put it at the heart of the place where their community gathered, where they prayed, where they heard the Torah read, where they observed the Sabbath together. It was an act of deep devotion and deep identity, connecting a small Galilean fishing community to the sacred heart of their people's faith in Jerusalem. Mary Magdalene, growing up in that community, would have seen that stone, or one very like it, at the center of her weekly worship. The woman who stood in a garden on Easter morning and heard her name spoken by a voice she knew. She was formed in that synagogue, shaped by that tradition, rooted in that community's love for the God of Israel. The ground at Magdala cannot speak her name, but it speaks her world. And that, I think, is something worth holding. In the chapter that follows, we are going to leave the ancient world and step into the modern one, into the world of best-selling novels and Harvard scholars and popular culture's endlessly inventive relationship with her name. I want to talk to you tonight about something that I think is genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. The way that Mary Magdalene's name and story have functioned in modern popular culture and in the world of contemporary scholarship. Because the truth is that the 20th and 21st centuries have not been quiet on this subject. Mary Magdalene has been at the center of best-selling novels, controversial films, heated academic debates, and sweeping popular reassessments. She has been claimed by feminist theologians, by conspiracy theorists, by novelists looking for a compelling mystery, by filmmakers looking for a controversial angle, and by careful biblical scholars trying to get back to what the ancient texts actually say. She has been declared the wife of Jesus, the mother of his child, the founder of a royal bloodline, the keeper of a secret tradition, none of which has any support in any ancient text, canonical or otherwise. And she has also been the subject of some of the most careful and honest biblical scholarship of the modern era, work that has genuinely helped the world understand her story more accurately than it has been understood for 14 centuries. Tonight, I want to walk through both of these streams, the popular and the scholarly, clearly and honestly, because I think both of them tell us something important about why this particular woman's name continues to carry such extraordinary weight. Let me start with the most commercially successful recent treatment of Mary Magdalene, because it is the one that most people have encountered, and because it is worth being very clear about. Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, published in 2003, became one of the best-selling novels in the history of publishing. And at its center is a claim about Mary Magdalene, that she was the wife of Jesus, that she was pregnant with his child at the time of his death, that she fled to southern France and established a bloodline there, and that this secret has been preserved and suppressed by the institutional church for 2,000 years. The novel is fiction, and Brown labeled it as such, but the framing of the book, which presents its historical and artistic claims as factual through the voice of a character described as a renowned expert, led many readers to take those claims as genuine historical revelations. I want to be direct with you. There is no ancient source, canonical or non-canonical, that describes Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus or as the mother of his child. None. The claim has no textual support in any document from any period of early Christianity. The source that Brown most prominently misuses is the Gospel of Philip, the Nag Hammadi text we explored in Chapter 8. Brown's novel has a character claim that this text calls Mary Magdalene Jesus' companion in a way that implies marriage, and that the text describes Jesus kissing her on the lips. As I noted when we discussed this text directly, the Coptic word koinonos means companion or partner in a general sense. It is not a word that carries marital or sexual connotations in its normal usage, and the passage describing a kiss is damaged in the manuscript at precisely the critical word, the word indicating where Jesus kissed her. So we genuinely do not know what it says there. Scholars, including Karen King, Elaine Pagels, and many others, have been consistent and clear on these points. The evidence simply does not support Brown's reading. The novel took a fragmentary, difficult, genuinely interesting ancient text and made it carry far more than it can honestly bear. And because the novel reached tens of millions of readers, while the scholarly corrections reached far fewer, the misreading spread widely and persists to this day. The so-called Jesus' wife fragment episode is another cautionary tale from the recent past that I think is worth knowing about. In 2012, a Harvard scholar named Karen King, whose careful work on the Gospel of Mary we have cited positively in this documentary, announced the existence of a small fragment of ancient papyrus that contained the phrase, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" King was appropriately cautious in her initial announcement, presenting it as a potentially significant find that required further study and authentication. But the announcement generated immediate and enormous popular attention, with many outlets running headlines claiming that an ancient text had been found confirming that Jesus had a wife. The problem, which became clear through subsequent forensic analysis, was that the fragment was a modern forgery. Multiple independent laboratory tests, including ink analysis, papyrus testing, and paleographic examination, concluded that the fragment was not authentically ancient. King herself ultimately accepted the forgery conclusion. The episode tells us something important. The appetite for evidence connecting Jesus and Mary Magdalene in a romantic or marital way is so strong in popular culture that it can create a significant public moment, even around a fragment that scholarly examination eventually determines to be fake. Now I want to shift from the sensational to the genuinely scholarly, because the same modern period that produced the Da Vinci Code and the wife fragment controversy also produced some of the most careful, honest, and illuminating work ever done on Mary Magdalene's actual place in early Christianity. Bart Ehrman, a scholar of early Christianity at the University of North Carolina, wrote a book specifically addressing these questions called Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene, published in 2006. Ehrman's approach is characteristic of his best work. He is rigorously committed to distinguishing between what the ancient sources actually say and what later tradition, legend, or popular culture has added. He walks through the canonical texts, the apocryphal texts, and the historical record with the same careful eye, and he consistently brings the reader back to the evidence. What I find most valuable about Ehrman's treatment is his willingness to say clearly when the evidence runs out, to mark the boundary between what we know and what we do not know, and to resist the temptation to fill the gap with speculation. That kind of intellectual honesty is, I think, one of the most important things a scholar studying ancient figures can bring to the work. Karen King's detailed study, The Gospel of Mary of Magdala, published in 2003, represents a different kind of scholarly contribution, one that takes the non-canonical tradition seriously as historical evidence without overstating what it can tell us. King reads the Gospel of Mary as a theological document from a specific early Christian community, and she treats it with the same textual care that biblical scholars bring to the canonical Gospels. She does not claim the Gospel of Mary is historically superior to the canonical accounts, nor does she dismiss it as irrelevant. She reads it for what it is, evidence of how some early Christians understood the figure of Mary Magdalene and what debates were alive in their communities. This kind of careful, middle-path scholarship, neither sensationalizing the non-canonical texts nor pretending they do not exist, represents, I think, the best of what modern scholarship on early Christianity has offered. The rise of feminist theology and feminist biblical scholarship in the latter decades of the 20th century created another important stream of engagement with Mary Magdalene's story. Elizabeth Schussler, Fiorenza's In Memory of Her, which we have mentioned several times across these chapters, argued that the history of early Christianity had systematically erased and minimized the roles of women, and that Mary Magdalene was one of the central figures whose importance had been undervalued. Schussler Fiorenza's work is simultaneously historical reconstruction and theological advocacy, and I think it is important to be clear about both of those dimensions. Where she argues from the actual texts, from Luke 8, from John 20, from the consistent placement of Mary Magdalene at the resurrection, her case is strong because the texts support it. Where she moves beyond the texts into reconstruction of what the earliest communities must have looked like, the argument becomes more interpretive and more contested. The distinction matters. An honest engagement with her work requires holding both dimensions in view. What I find most interesting about the cultural fascination with Mary Magdalene in the modern period, the novels, the films, the academic debates, the popular reassessments, is what it reveals about the questions that her story continues to raise for people today. Why does this particular name generate such extraordinary energy? I think it is because her story sits at the intersection of several things that contemporary culture cares about deeply. The question of whose voice gets heard and whose gets dismissed. The question of whether the historical record has been shaped by those in power at the expense of those who were not. And the question of whether the foundations of one of the world's major religious traditions are as settled as they appear. These are not trivial questions. They are worth asking. But they deserve to be asked with genuine respect for the evidence, with the same care that Bauckham and Ehrman and King bring to the ancient texts, rather than answered with the kind of confident fictional invention that a best-selling novel can get away with. The real Mary Magdalene's story, as we have seen together across these chapters, is interesting enough to stand on its own without embellishment. The 2018 film, simply titled Mary Magdalene, directed by Garth Davis and starring Rooney Mara, represents a recent attempt to tell her story on screen in a way that draws more carefully on the canonical tradition than most previous cinematic treatments. The film portrays her as a thoughtful, spiritually perceptive woman from Magdala who follows Jesus and ultimately witnesses the resurrection. A portrait closer to the Gospels than most of what Hollywood has previously offered, though still inevitably shaped by contemporary storytelling conventions and interpretive choices. It received mixed reviews, but its existence reflects something real. There is a genuine and widespread hunger to engage with Mary Magdalene's story honestly, to move past the legend and the sensationalism and the composite figure, and to find the actual woman the ancient sources describe. That hunger is, I think, one of the most hopeful things about the current cultural moment around her name. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, I want to acknowledge something that I think is important for how we hold everything we have explored together across this documentary. The modern cultural fascination with Mary Magdalene, however much of it has been driven by sensationalism or wish fulfillment or ideological agenda, has had one genuinely positive effect. It has brought millions of people into contact with questions about early Christianity and the role of women in it that they might never otherwise have asked. The Da Vinci Code, whatever its historical failings, sent millions of people to their libraries and their browsers, asking who this woman actually was. And some of those people found the genuine scholarship. Some of them found the gospel texts. Some of them read Luke 8 for the first time, or followed the footnotes to Bochum or Ehrman or King, or looked up what the Eastern Orthodox Church had been saying about her for 2,000 years. The sensationalism opened a door, even if it could not tell the truth about what lay beyond it. In our final chapter, we are going to walk through that door together and sit with what we find. The woman the texts actually show us, stripped of everything added after the fact, simply present in the ancient pages where she has always been. We have come a long way together across these chapters. We have walked through the archaeology of a first-century Galilean fishing town, through the political pressures of Roman occupation, through the careful language of 4 gospel accounts, through an extraordinary garden scene on a Sunday morning before sunrise. We have sat with the 3rd century church father, who first called her apostle to the apostles, with the 6th century pope, whose homily changed how the Western world understood her name, with medieval legend makers and Renaissance painters and modern novelists and Harvard scholars. We have tried at every step to be honest about what the sources actually say, to mark the difference between what the ancient texts record and what later centuries added, to resist the temptation to fill the silence of Scripture with the noise of interpretation. And tonight, in this final chapter, I want to do the simplest thing of all. I want to set aside everything that was added later, the legend, the art, the Gnostic speculation, the popular fiction, the medieval tradition, and sit quietly with the woman who actually appears in the pages of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Because I believe that what the texts give us, once you clear away 2,000 years of accumulation, is not a diminished figure. It is an extraordinary one, and I want to share her with you tonight as gently and as honestly as I can. Let me begin with what we know for certain from the canonical texts, the texts that form the biblical record. She was from Magdala, a real town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, a prosperous fishing community in the 1st century CE. She had been healed of something the gospel writers described as 7 demons, an affliction the text does not further specify, in a healing the text does not further describe, which left her changed and free. In Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, she is listed first among a group of women who traveled with Jesus and the 12 disciples through Galilee, and who supported the ministry financially from their own resources. She gave her time, her money, and her presence to a traveling religious movement led by a Galilean teacher. These are the first facts the text gives us about her, and they are already, in their quiet way, remarkable. In the world she lived in, this was not the expected path for a woman. She walked it anyway. From that point forward in the gospel narrative, we can trace her presence at every critical moment, with a consistency that no other female figure in the New Testament matches. She was at the crucifixion. Matthew chapter 27, verses 55 and 56, places her among the women watching from a distance as Jesus died on the cross. Women described as those who had followed him from Galilee and ministered to him. She had come all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem, and she stayed for the worst moment, Mark chapter 15, verse 47, records that she watched where Joseph of Arimathea laid the body. She made note of it. She was paying attention. She was the kind of person who did not look away. Luke chapter 23, verse 49, notes that those who knew Jesus, including the women from Galilee, stood at a distance watching. John chapter 19, verse 25, places her even closer, not watching from a distance, but standing directly at the foot of the cross. 4 different accounts, 4 slightly different pictures, but in all 4 of them, she is there, present, not absent, not fled, there. What strikes me every time I trace this pattern through the 4 Gospels is the contrast it makes with the disciples' response. When Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, Mark chapter 14 verse 50 tells us that they all fled. The men who had shared the Last Supper, who had sworn their loyalty, who had debated among themselves about which of them was the greatest, they ran, and the women stayed. Mary Magdalene stayed. I do not say this to diminish the disciples. Their fear was human and understandable, and many of them went on to give everything they had to the movement they had briefly abandoned. But the texts record what they record, and what they record is that she was there when many others were not. The scholar Richard Balcom, in his work Gospel Women, writes about this quality of her presence in terms of what he calls faithful witness, the kind of testimony that is credible precisely because it does not abandon its post at the moments when abandonment would have been the easier choice. Now let me tell you about the burial. Luke chapter 23, verses 55 and 56, tells us that the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb, saw how the body was laid and where the tomb was, and then went away to prepare spices and ointments for a proper burial, planning to return after the Sabbath. This is a detail that I find deeply human and deeply moving. They were not passive bystanders in some metaphorical sense. They were practically engaged, making plans, preparing materials, doing the work of honoring someone they loved according to the customs of their people. They had watched the burial. They knew where the tomb was. They were going to come back. And Mary Magdalene, named in all 4 resurrection accounts, was among those women who came back in the early morning while it was still dark, carrying their spices and their plans, and found something entirely beyond what they had planned for. We have explored the garden scene in detail in chapter 6, so I do not want to repeat what we covered there. But I do want to return to one aspect of it tonight in this final chapter, because I think it carries a particular weight when you hold it against the full picture we have built across this documentary. John chapter 20, verse 16, records the moment when Jesus speaks Mary Magdalene's name in the garden, and she recognizes him. In the entire Gospel of John, a gospel full of extended theological discourses, of elaborate signs and miraculous works, of long conversations between Jesus and Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well, the most intimate and personal post-resurrection encounter is this one. A woman's name spoken aloud in a garden before full sunrise. No theological lecture, no extended discourse, just her name in a voice she knew, in the first light of a Sunday morning. And she responded with a word that contained everything, Rabboni, my teacher. The scholar Sandra Schneiders, in her theological reading of this passage, reflects on what it means that the first word spoken to the risen Christ in John's Gospel is spoken by this woman, and what it means that the first word the risen Christ speaks is her name. I find that worth sitting with quietly tonight. After the garden, she was sent. John chapter 20, verse 17, records the commission explicitly. Go to my brothers and tell them. She went. Luke chapter 24, verse 10, records that she and the other women told the 11 and all the rest. The message was delivered. The canonical account of her active ministry ends there. The text does not follow her further, does not tell us where she went after the resurrection appearances concluded, and does not describe the rest of her life. The ancient texts simply do not tell us. And I think honesty requires us to sit with that silence rather than fill it, to resist the temptation of the French legend, the Gnostic elaboration, the modern fictional invention. We do not know what happened to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. We know what she did during the ministry and at the Passion and on Easter morning. And what she did was enough to ensure that her name was written into all four Gospels, placed first in the resurrection witness lists, honored across 20 centuries of Christian tradition, on both sides of the great divide between East and West. The traditions that have honored her across those centuries are worth naming, because they represent something genuine. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which never confused her with anyone else, has called her equal to the apostles from its earliest centuries, and celebrated her feast on July 22nd with that title intact. The title of Apostle to the Apostles, given to her by Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century and affirmed by Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th and formally acknowledged by Pope Francis in the 21st, is not an invention of feminist theology or modern wishful thinking. It is a recognition that has deep roots in the earliest layers of Christian interpretation. The Eastern title, Is Apostolos, is even stronger, placing her in the company of the greatest missionaries and witnesses the tradition knows. Both of these honors are grounded in the same simple fact. She was there, she saw, and she was sent. That is the definition. She met it. I want to acknowledge, in this final chapter, something that I think is true about why her story has attracted so much invention and elaboration across the centuries. There is genuine silence around her life, before her healing and after the resurrection morning. And human beings find silence very difficult to leave alone. The medieval legend makers who sent her to Provence, the Gnostic communities who made her the privileged receiver of secret revelation, the modern novelists who made her Jesus's wife and the mother of his child. All of them were, in their different ways, responding to the same impulse, the desire to complete a story that the ancient sources left incomplete. I understand that impulse. I feel it myself when I read Luke chapter 8 and wish it told me more about who she was before the healing, what her family was like, what her childhood in Magdala had been. The silence is real, and the desire to fill it is human. But I think the honest response to that desire is to name it for what it is, an interpretive impulse, a creative response to fragmentary evidence, and to be clear about the line between it and the text itself. What the texts give us, when we read them honestly and carefully, is a woman defined entirely by her faithfulness. She was faithful to the movement she joined. She was faithful in her financial support of it. She was faithful at the crucifixion when others were not. She was faithful at the burial. She was faithful enough to come to the tomb before dawn, alone in the dark, carrying spices for a body she expected to find exactly where she had last seen it placed. And when the story turned out to be something entirely different from what she had expected, when the tomb was empty, when the angels were there, when the voice spoke her name, she was faithful in carrying the news, faithful in delivering the message she had been given, even to people who dismissed it as idle talk. That quality of faithfulness, uncelebrated, undramatic, simply consistent, runs through every canonical reference to her like a thread. It is, I think, the truest thing the texts tell us about who she was. And so, as this chapter draws to its close, and as this documentary draws to its close, I want to leave you with her as the texts give her to us. Not the composite penitent of Gregory's sermon, not the Gnostic revealer of secret knowledge, not the wife and royal bloodline ancestor of Dan Brown's imagination, not the flowing-haired, alabaster jar-holding icon of 14 centuries of Western art. Just a woman from a fishing town on the Sea of Galilee, healed of something profound, who chose to follow a teacher she believed in, who gave what she had to his work, who stood at the worst moment and did not run, who came to a garden before sunrise to tend to a body, and who heard her name spoken in the early light and knew the voice immediately. The texts give us someone defined not by her past or her legend, but by her presence, by the simple, repeated fact of being there, of staying, of going when sent. That woman, that quiet, faithful first witness, does not need anything added to make her extraordinary. She already is. She always was. And she has been waiting in the pages of the ancient texts for anyone willing to read her honestly. I hope that tonight, together, we have,